17. The Haderach Desert. Here's another chapter. Again, this is short and pretty much sticks with the events that happen in the book, but it will get exciting and longer soon, so hang on. Thank you to all the people who commented on my last two chapters, and I hope that you enjoy this one. Murtagh shaded his eyes from the glare of the bright sun. The desert was a vast expanse of dunes that stretched as far as the eye could see. A light breeze stirred the reddish gold sand into the air and reshaped the dunes around them. The plants that grew in the desert were tough and scraggly, able to survive on little water. The air was hot and dry. The only animal he could see was a distant hawk circling high above. In the distance was a line of purple crags that rose from the desert. "You're sure we'll find food for the horses out there?" asked Iragan worriedly. "Yes," said Arya. Raising one hand to point out across the vast expanse of sand towards the crags, she continued, "A kind of sparse, tough grass grows around those. It is tough but will be enough for the horses." Brahm sighed and raised his head to look at the sky. Not a cloud could be seen, and the sun beat down relentlessly. "Let us rest for a little while and wait until nightfall to continue." No one had the energy to argue or the desire to, and so they untied Zoe from Sahira, ate, and then lay in the shadow of a dune for an afternoon nap. Saphira curled up beside them, spreading her wings to form a kind of tent over top that blocked out the sun and the faint, dry desert breeze that provided no respite from the heat. Within moments, they were all fast asleep. Since their escape from Gilead 4 days ago, they had covered over 35 leagues. Saphira woke the travelers after only a few hours of rest. Too short to be sure, but enough that their minds were clear and the horses were ready to continue. The sun was hovering above the horizon, and already there was a cool chill to the air that was invigorating. Despite the impressive distance they had covered, Brahm reminded them that the Empire would not so easily allow its prey to slip through its net. Arya was quick to add her own cautions to his, and so they left their small camp as soon as possible. Zoe remained unchanged, her breathing slow and rhythmical. The stars had just come out when they reached the crags that they had seen that morning. The crags rose from the sand like the imposing stone walls of some mighty fortress. The ground around the stone was hard, and when Murtagh dismounted from Tornak, he could feel the heat from the baked ground. Letting the horses eat some of the sparse grass around the rocky face of one of the crags, the companions settled around a small fire. Above them, the night sky glimmered and sparkled with the light of thousands, aproned thousands of stars. A bright half-moon sent cool light across the desert. "Look at them," said Arya, gazing up at the heavens. "That is one of the few nice things I can say about the desert," said Brahm with a small chuckle. "The night sky is beautiful." "Maybe," said Murtagh with a smirk, "if you're an elf." Arya raised an eyebrow but said nothing, choosing to ignore Murtagh's small dig. Iragan meanwhile had been thinking and finally voiced a question that had been nagging him since before Gilead. "What will happen when we reach the Varden?" Something about the distant glittering stars far above him had reminded him of all the expectations resting on his and Saphira's shoulders. He felt as if the world had just opened up, and the possibilities for him and Saphira were as endless as the sand dunes stretching as far as the eyes could see. Once they had reached the Varden, what would happen? There would be conflicting interests and powers that would be anxious to control him and Saphira. He wanted to know at least what Arya expected of him, so that he had some sort of warning before throwing himself and Saphira into a snake pit. Or perhaps, thought Iragan, Saphira and I could just leave that behind us. "No one can force us to fight." "Really?" said a nagging little voice. "Would you really be able to justify running away after all you have seen and done? What about Roran, the slaves in Drasleona? You are supposed to be a rider, not a coward." And yet, for all that, he knew that he would rather never go to the Varden. He had dreamed of a life of adventure and danger, but now he felt as if he had chosen by some accident. Now he found himself longing for the quiet life he had lived before Saphira when he was just Iragan. Going to the Varden would mean declaring himself once and for all. They would expect him to be the rider who carried them to victory, who gave them hope when they had none. Fighting with the Varden meant going up against Durza, the Razak, and finally, Galbatorix. It meant dealing with political intrigue and traveling all the way to Do Weldenvarden for more grueling training. "You and I must continue on to Do Weldenvarden so you can complete your training," said Arya. her thoughts drifting towards Du Weldenvarden and what awaited Iragan and Saphira there. She was not prepared for the sharp response her answer received from Iragan. Iragan could not help but snap. Do Saphira, and I have any say in our futures? He knew it was wrong to vent his feelings in such a way, but he was so frustrated with everything. Frustrated that he was expected to follow along and do what was asked of him by those with more experience. Little one, chided Saphira from the privacy of their thoughts. You should not let yourself vent your frustration on those who have our best interests at heart. I don't care, Saphira, you should. She snapped before ending the conversation, her irritation with him flowing across their mental link. Iragan ignored her, breaking the contact between them as much as he ever could. Brahm met Iragan's eyes and said softly, I know how it feels, Iragan, but you know the reasons for going to do Weldenvarden. If you're going to be strong enough to match Galbatorix, you must seek help from the elves. If you want to truly become a rider, you must trust Arya and I on this matter. Iragan said nothing in response, just stared moodily at the fire. Resentment and irritation colored his thoughts a nasty red. He was tired of being treated like he knew nothing, like a child. Young he was, he wouldn't deny it, but ignorant of his and Saphira's position. No, he knew, and he was tired of being treated like he didn't. Both he and Saphira had yet to truly declare his allegiance either way, and that made them a dangerous enemy to both the Varden and the Empire. It made Galbatorix reluctant to attack him and Saphira directly. Added to those thoughts was the nagging feeling that he could just leave. Fly away with Saphira once Zoe reached the Varden. He and Saphira could just leave and choose a life away from the bloodshed. Part of him refused to even consider that option after all he had seen in the Empire. But another part of him wanted to just leave it all behind. The part of him that had been longing for Carvahall and what it represented. The part of him that felt too young, too untried to even try and do half the things he would need to do as a rider. Neither Arya nor Brahm said anything, just exchanged glances as if saying, we will deal with this later. That look only served to add to the growing fire of resentment that was burning within him. When would they finally treat him like the rider he was supposed to be? When he finished training with the elves? Or when he finally proved without a shadow of the doubt that he was now a rider and not the farm boy from Carvahall? That time could not come soon enough for him. Murtagh glanced at his younger half-brother, who was glaring at the small fire. His intense brown eyes were stormy, and his shoulders were tense. Silently, Murtagh agreed with Iragan. He understood how it felt to be kept purposely in the dark, while others used him to further their own plans. Arya and Brahm may be noble, and so might this Ajahad. But in the end, if Iragan did not take control of his future, he would be an easily controlled pawn. The Varden were desperate for a rider, and he had no doubt that many of its leaders would leap at the chance to control Iragan, and through him, the Varden. Murtagh silently promised himself to speak to Iragan about it when he had the chance. He did not want to send his brother into the midst of such a deadly game with no warning or advice. Iragan had to, for his and Saphira's survival, take control of his own destiny. If Arya and Brahm did not want to broach such a potentially volatile subject, then he would. He understood all too well how difficult it was to lose one's freedom. The chance to speak with Iragan came the next day. They had stopped mid-morning in the shadow of one of the rocky crevices. The horses were picketed close by, and the shadow of the rocky outcrop provided some welcome shade from the hot sun. Arya and Brahm were speaking quietly a little ways away, and Saphira had curled up beside Iragan, letting the two boys use her body as a sort of backrest. Iragan had been moody and silent ever since the conversation last night, speaking even less and ignoring any comment directed at him by Brahm or Arya. The rider was sitting with his back against Saphira's side, one hand idly playing with the hilt of Zarok. He did not react when Murtagh took a seat beside him, and in a voice too soft for anyone but Saphira and Iragan to hear, said, Iragan, I want to speak to you about the Varden, what you will do once we reach it. Iragan raised an eyebrow and said, Why, what is there to say that you cannot say in front of Brahm or Arya? There is more than little, Iragan. You know the kind of place I grew up in, Iragan. Galbatorix's court was full of backstabbing nobles, social climbers, and people who were all too eager to use me as their ticket to the king's graces. I had to be very careful to maintain my independence. It will be the same for you, Saphira, when you get to the Varden. Arya and Brahm have to trust them because they are their allies, but that does not mean you can't keep them at arm's length. You're saying that I should not trust the people that I must trust. The people who I need at my side if I want to kill Galbatorix. What I'm saying is that if you don't follow your heart and guard your freedom with your life then, Murtagh paused before continuing, then you will be an easily controlled pawn. We must trust the Varden for Zoe's sake, but you should not trust them like a fool. You can't rely on Arya. She has her own loyalties, and who knows what the elves will want from you. Nor can you completely trust Brahm, for he is closely linked to the Varden. No, Eragon, Murtagh gripped his brother's shoulder. You can only trust Saphira. Murtagh had spoken with all the urgency and sincerity he could find within himself. He felt a little desperate. This was Eragon. His brother was hopelessly ignorant when it came to court intrigue. To him, trust came easily when it shouldn't, and Murtagh wished to impress upon him the importance of his words. If he could offer nothing else to the rider, then he hoped this lesson would stick. For a long second there was nothing but the sound of the desert wind. The silence felt oppressive and tense as Eragon considered Murtagh's words, his face impassive as he stared at his hands. Finally, just as Murtagh was beginning to feel uncomfortable, Eragon spoke. "There is one thing I do know," said Eragon with a small smile, "and it's that I can trust you and Zoe." Murtagh opened his mouth to protest, but Eragon cut him off. "No, listen, Murtagh. I am glad you told me this. For I admit, I know little of politics, but I do know is that neither you nor Zoe will hold back information because of future plans for me and Saphira. I have become tired of Brahm and Arya's silence on matters that I must understand sooner rather than later." Murtagh stared silently at his brother for a long moment as he understood the full breadth of his brother's words. Eragon trusted him. Yes, that was easy enough feat for the rider who had yet to experience treachery and betrayal, but still, it meant a great deal more than Eragon could imagine. His brother knew his heritage, his upbringing, and yet still accepted him as if that did not matter. The novelty of it had yet to wear off. Speaking softly, Murtagh said, "I suppose you are right, Eragon. I just hope that you remember my advice and never let another try to take your freedom from you. I don't think I'll be able to come to rescue every time. Neither will Zoe." The two boys chuckled slightly before setting up their bedrolls. Murtagh was asleep within moments, but Eragon lay awake, thinking over Murtagh's words. They resonated with a part of him that had been growing steadily more and more irritated with both Brahm and Arya. The part of him that Zoe had always managed to keep in check with her reassurances, challenges, and encouragements. Saphira, yes, little one. What do you think of Murtagh's advic? I agree with him, but we must balance his words with our own knowledge. I am worried of what our arrival in the Varden will mean. They will expect me to be something I am not yet, and I have never had to deal with politics. Remember, little one, that you have strong allies on your side. Brahm, Murtagh, and Zoe do not wish you to become a puppet controlled by others, nor would I allow it. Arya serves her own queen, and for that we must wary of her advice, but she can offer us her own strategies for dealing with the Varden. Trust yourself, trust our bond, our friends, and what we believe in. Brahm may have his own plans, but he only wants what is best for us and for Alagaesia. We must trust, for now, to them and what are fighting for. But Saphira, that is part of the problem. I don't know if fighting the Empire is what I want. You and I can just leave this behind. No one can stop us from flying away and never looking back. Think of all the things we could do instead of this senseless and never-ending fight. Could we, little one? Saphira's voice had become demanding, like a challenge to his dark thoughts. Could we abandon Zoe, Brahm, Murtagh, and all those who struggle under Galbeorix's rule? Eragon paused before saying, "I know, we could not. We cannot walk away without helping them. It is our fate as rider and dragon to fight when the time comes." Eragon was about to argue, but Saphira enveloped his consciousness in a warm blanket of love and reassurance. Before he could say anything else, Eragon felt himself slipping into a dreamless sleep on the soft sand of the Haderach desert. This pattern of riding until the heat became unbearable and waiting until nightfall continued for another 2 days. It was 2 days of the worst travel Murtagh had ever endured. The desert seemed never-ending, and he found himself wondering if they would ever leave it, or if they would continue to wander aimlessly around the stony crags and sand dunes. It was on the second day of riding that the distant shapes of the bear appeared in front of them. At first, both Iragan and Murtagh thought they were the shapes of hills, but Arya explained to them that they really were the base of the bears. The idea that mountains could be as huge as to be too tall to see the top of was more than a little mind-blowing. He had heard the stories, but had always dismissed them as exaggerations. Now, Murtagh regretted all the times he had dismissed the stories as untrue. It made him wonder how many other stories he had dismissed as untrue were actually accurate descriptions of events or places. With one of the first smiles he had smiled since entering the desert, Iragan said, "I hope that the animals that live in the bears aren't in proportion to the mountains." Arya laughed lightly and said, "I'm afraid that they are Iragan. There are bears and wolves large enough to be a formidable match for Saphira." The tension between Iragan, Arya, and Brahm had eased a little, but it was still there, simmering under the surface like a forgotten ember. Soon there would be another confrontation on the matter. Murtagh urged Tornak forward and said over his shoulder, "What are you waiting for? We don't have any time to waste." Looking forward at the distant mountains, Murtagh couldn't help but smile, a small balloon of hope growing inside of him. He ignored the amused looks that Arya, Iragan, and Brahm exchanged before catching up with him. By the time the sun sunk below the horizon, they were out of the desert completely and camped at the base of the mountains by a fast-moving stream of cold mountain water. Sand had slowly transformed from loose grains of reddish sand to hard dirt to lush grasslands where gazelles bounded away from them. I was drifting with no real purpose among the distant memories of my childhood. I had a vague feeling that I was supposed to do something important, but I couldn't remember what it was. Despite the relative peace of the darkness that surrounded me, I felt a growing urgency. Time was running out, and I knew, deep down, that it was me who was running out of time. Yet, no matter what I did, I could not wake from my trance, and so I lay there hoping that someone would wake me from this trance, this darkness, before I was lost to it. Before I was nothing more than a distant memory of another time lost in the sands of time. 18. Chapter 19. The companions rose before dawn feeling refreshed and ready to continue. The sun had yet to rise, but the pinkish glow to the east signaled its imminent arrival. Once Zoe was secured on Saphira's back, they rode on. The horses were eager to continue, and they made good progress, moving from the grasslands into the foothills that rose at the base of the giant mountains. The ground was soft, and the dirt a rich black color. Iragan could not help but think that, if he ever wanted to farm again, this would be a fine place to do it. The grasslands teemed with wildlife, from deer to hawks circling high above. For a few hours they rode in silence. Their footsteps, while no less urgent, did not seem as heavy here as if they had somehow shed a little of their weariness upon entering this fair, fresh landscape. But the quiet, almost calm, air among the companions did not last for long, and it was disrupted by a cold reminder of their enemies. They had just reached the top of one of the rolling foothills when Murtagh gasped and pulled his stallion up sharply. The sudden and surprising noise made the others stop their horses and turn to see Murtagh had twirled Tornak to look back the way they had come, back towards the burning desert and empire. The reason for his abrupt halt quickly became apparent to the others as they saw a long line of black figures marching inexorably towards them. It was distant, a thin black line that was just clear enough for them to make out the crimson banner that was held aloft by some standard bearer. Murtagh clearly knew who the flag belonged to, however. Long years spent at Galbatorix's court had taught him to recognize that flag from a long distance and to avoid the one who bore it like the plague. His voice conveying both fear and worry, Murtagh said, "That flag belongs an Urgal leader." He turned his eyes to look at Brahm, who was squinting against the bright sunlight at the distant army. "You know him?" asked Iragan. He felt a knot of tense fear grow inside of him. A few Urgals was bad enough, but an entire army of them. Suddenly the race to save Zoe's life took on another meaning. Now they might have to race to save their own. "Do I know him?" asked Murtagh sharply. His voice rose slightly. "I know him all too well. He is the worst of his kind, and if he has caught our scent, then he will not let us go, especially if he has heard about Gilead. It is not in his nature to allow prey to escape his clutches, and if it is prey that will earn him favor with the king, then he will be all the more eager to catch us alive." Murtagh clearly wanted to say more, but held his tongue as if sensing that adding more dark words would do nothing to either change the situation or increase anyone's focus. "This must be what Zoe meant," said Bram, his voice low with shocked horror. "Galbatorix is gathering an army of Urgals to destroy the Varden. She told us of this before we reached Gilead." Arya grimaced and said quietly, "It seems we have another reason for our race to the Varden, warning them of this new threat." "Not just warning them," said Murtagh tensely, "but saving our own lives. They will have found our trail by now and seen Saphira's tracks." Reaching out to Saphira, who was hunting a few leagues away, Eragon explained the situation. She was predictably worried, and it took a great deal of persuasion to keep her from flying right above them. Finally, she reluctantly agreed to fly high enough not to be seen, but still close enough that she would be able to reach them in time should they need her help. Nothing more was said. Nothing more needed to be said. Filled with new desperation, they rode harder than ever and were able to put a little distance between them and the Urgal army. It was uncertain whether or not the Urgals were following them, but no one wanted to risk the chance that they were. Besides, as Murtagh had pointed out, their trail was hardly inconspicuous, and if the commander wanted to increase his standing in Galbatorix's eyes, then he would be more than anxious to capture the rider and dragon. No, thought Eragon as he leaned over Kadok's sweaty neck. They were in a precarious position. On one hand there was Zoe dying slowly but surely, while on the other was capture and death at the hands of Urgal. Somehow, in between these two, they had to find a way to succeed, and it was fraught with dangers. It was late afternoon when Saphira informed them of a group of 20 or so horsemen traveling towards them. Eragon relayed the information along with Saphira's suggestion that they may be from the Varden. He was rather hoping it was the Varden. A few more warriors would not be amiss if it did come to fighting, or at least some secret way of avoiding the Urgals and making it to the safety of Farthen Dur. Arya quickly dismissed the idea and dashed any hopes Eragon might have come up with out of desperation. No, the Varden would not be this far away Farthen Dur. When they do leave the Bears, they travel through tunnels to Surda or do Weldenvarden. I fear that we are about to meet some slavers. Ready your blades and have Saphira fly close Eragon." "And," said Bram, "say nothing, any of you. Let me speak to them, and if worse comes to worse, then we will need Saphira. The bands of slavers who ride in this land are a ruthless bunch." Turning his thoughts to Saphira, Eragon told her, "It may be slavers. Stay close and be ready to fight." Saphira angled her flight so she was hidden in a cloud straight above them. It was not long before they saw a cloud of swirling dust, the bright flash of steel in the sunlight, and the crazed look in the horses' eyes. Arya raised the hood of her cloak to cover her face, and all of them loosened their swords in preparation of a fight. "Could we not outride them?" asked Eragon. He felt the familiar buzz of adrenaline that accompanied the start of every fight, and yet he wished they could just outride these men. He had killed before, but it was not some he wished to experience again. "No," said Murtagh. "Look at their horses. They are built for speed while ours are meant for war and distance, not sprinting. Even if we could snowfare, Tornak, Cadocs, and Melinlas do not have the energy to outlast them for any great distance. Better to face them now." "Remember, let me do the talking," said Bram in a low voice. "I have dealt with situations like this before." Eragon and Murtagh exchanged glances, silently agreeing that no matter how many situations similar to this one Bram had been in, that did not give them any guarantee of safety. Besides, each moment that they waited, each second that ticked by, brought enemies closer, and Zoe a little closer to the doorstep of death. The riders stopped their horses at the top of the hill and looked down at them. Looking the group of 20 or so scruffy riders any hope that they were merely scouts for the Varden quickly faded. These men looked like the dregs of society from Dras Leona that Eragon had seen lurking in the shadows of buildings. Their weapons were rusty and uncared for. No trained soldier would ever let his equipment fall into disrepair. After all, in battle, a sharp sword could mean life or death, as could a well-strung bow or oiled knife. But these men were rough. They had a vicious, desperate look to them, as if the hard struggle for life had taught them only one thing, and that was to fight and fight hard. Eragon dropped his hand to the wire-wrapped hilt of Zarok. Beside him, Murtagh muttered, I think this is going to turn into a bloody fight. Arya glanced at him briefly. I fear you are right, Murtagh. The elf looked completely calm, her green irises examining the men with a calculating glint. Everything about her spoke of the relaxed calm before a storm breaks, or the slowly increasing pressure on a spring before it snaps back. Eragon turned his attention back to the men watching from the hill. His insides jumped with nerves, but on the outside he felt calm ready. He had to come to expect, even welcome these feelings. He knew that they were what made him truly alive, what gave him the courage and strength to fight and win. Besides, he whispered in his mind, Saphira is around, and she can always step in if things get too out of hand. The leader of the men suddenly let loose a wild war cry and swirled his mace in the air as he galloped his horse straight towards the four riders. Caddock shifted nervously under Eragon, but he soothed the worried horse with his mind, while also impressing upon him the importance of listening to him when the time came. It was difficult to convey these feelings to Caddock, but Eragon felt reasonably confident that, when the fight began, the horse would not act silly. While Caddock had been in a few small skirmishes, the horse was not the trained war horse that Tornak was. He did not yet know how to evade a javelin or how to hold his course when all his instincts told him to flee. When they were completely surrounded, the leader drew his horse to stop in front of them. His face was unpleasant with greasy brown hair, a ragged beard, and small black beady eyes that examined them critically as if they were interesting vases for sale at a market, and he wished to make a smart purchase. Eragon found him deeply repulsive, and he could see from the faint scowl on Murtagh's face that his brother was of the same opinion. He smiled, showing a few broken and missing teeth, and said in an overly cheerful voice, Well, well, look at what we have here, boys. What are you lot doing out this far from the safety of your home? The men around them exchanged amused smirks, as if sharing an inside joke. Eragon's hand on Zarok tightened even more. He longed to yank the sword from its sheath and act as impulsively as he had when the Urgles had chased them. However, a voice that sounded like Zoe's whispered, Remember what happened that time. Wait until the right time and strike when they don't expect it. Thinking of his friend gave Eragon some heart. Zoe would never have backed down when confronted by these men, but neither would she have acted rashly. What is to you? Asked Brahm coolly. I suggest you leave, and quickly, or we will have to resort to rather unpleasant methods. You dare to threaten me and my men. The leader smiled a crooked smile and shook his head in amusement. It was clear to the companions that both he and his men found the idea of them posing any sort of threat to be ludicrous enough to be amusing. A few of the unshaved, rough-looking men laughed aloud. The sound of their laughter was harsh against the air, and it made the horses prance nervously. Let me tell you this, old man. Slaves, which means you, do not ask questions, nor do they speak out of line. If you're too old to learn that, then we might just have to stick you full of arrows and take that lovely lady and these two strong lads. They will fetch a high price. Eragon glared angrily at the slaver. His anger was beginning to boil through his veins, and he did not need to look at Murtagh or Arya to know that they were as ready as he to fight. They all were experiencing the urge to teach these slavers a lesson. As he gazed at these men, he remembered the slaves he had seen in the Empire. Men, women, and children who bore the cruel scars of whips and manacles. Was this not what he, as a rider, was supposed to do? Avenge these wrongs. In the end, they did not need to wait long. Before the leader of the slavers could do anything or say anything more, Brahm whipped his sword out of its sheath. Eragon immediately understood. Yanking Zarok out, he pressed his heels to Caddock's sides, and at the same time, he roared to Saphira now. High above, he felt her begin a steep dive straight toward them. The suddenness of their attack surprised the slavers, and they were unprepared when the companions struck. Eragon engaged a man, easily disarming him before delivering the fatal blow. For a second the rider was stunned, he had killed, but there was little time to think on what he had just done or the sword in his hand, which seemed to glitter with vicious glee. Beside him, Murtagh fought with a savage gleam in his eyes, as if possessed by some demon. A little ways away, Eragon saw Melinla's rear as Arya duelled fiercely with three men, her blade shining red with blood. Eragon returned his attention completely to the slaver in front of him. Adrenaline coursed through his veins as he traded blows before once again finding an opening and killing the man in front of him. The slavers were not the skilled opponents that Aragon was used to fighting. These men had never had the lessons in technique or learned the discipline that he had, but instead relied on brute force and numbers. Just the slavers had begun to recover from the surprise of their attack, they received another surprise. This one was the last thing any of them could ever have expected. In fact, it was the kind of thing few people would have expected if they had been in the slaver's position. For diving down from a fluffy white cloud with her blue scales, all a-glitter was Sapphira. A real and very much alive dragon. An angry dragon, too. Could any man be blamed for fleeing? The sight of the dragon, as she flared her massive blue wings and landed with a mighty thud on the ground, sent the horses into a frenzied panic. To Aragon, however, she had never looked more magnificent or more like a legend of days long past. Her blue scales and ivory claws contrasted against the bright green grass. Those giant blue eyes, usually kind and gentle, glowed red with anger, and they were fixed on the slavers. And this dragon, this beautiful Sapphira, was his to call partner. That he was lucky enough, nay privileged, to be bonded with her made his heart leap with wild joy, and his entire self felt alive with the wonder of it all. "I am glad you are impressed," she said with a small laugh in his mind. "I am more than impressed," he said to her with a silent laugh of his own. "I am awestruck." Opening her jaws wide, the dragoness roared. The roar conveyed her obvious anger, and that was all it took to send the slavers galloping away. Their horses were running blind with fear, and the men all too eager to be gone as fast as possible in a desperate attempt to put as much distance between them and the dragon as was possible. Even Melinlas, Kadok, Snowfer, and Tornak, used to Sapphira, shied away from her and loosed their own nervous whinnies into the sky. "Yes," said the dragon to Aragon, "that was very well done, if I do say so myself. It was superb." In the mad rush to escape, the leader of the slavers was thrown by his horse as the animal had spun and bolted. As the dust cleared, the rider was able to see him as he really was when not surrounded by his ragged warriors. When he pushed himself up, Aragon realized that he was not a very big man, nor did he look like any kind of threat. He had lost his cocky air and mocking words. Now he just looked pathetic in his open fear. Bram rode Snowfer forward, bloody sword raised, as he gazed down at the man. The white stallion's sides were splattered with red gore, and he danced on the spot, his black hooves sinking into the soft turf that was stained with the red blood of the fallen men. In a very cold voice, Bram spoke. "I will spare your life. Not that you deserve it, but because I will not kill an unarmed man in such a way, no matter who they are or what they have done." Murtagh muttered under his breath, just loud enough for Aragon to hear. So much for knowing how to deal with situations like this. Inside, Aragon was torn. On one hand, he agreed with Murtagh, and on the other, he agreed with Bram. Because suddenly, he found himself not sure that he could kill a man if it was not in open combat. Could he look into someone's eyes and kill them without hesitation if it was not in the heat of battle? Even if he knew the full scope of their crimes and knew, logically, that they deserved the death. Suddenly he was quite glad that he was not the one in Bram's place, and that, despite having killed men, he had never had to sentence anyone to death. He was not sure he had was it courage, or ruthlessness? He did not know. This problem was beyond him, for in the end, he knew he was still very young, and this kind of experience he had not garnered yet. Arya obviously took Murtagh's side and rode Melinlas forward, bloody sword still held high as if ready to duel Bram over the matter. Splattered with gore and in her dirty clothes, the elf looked a little less perfect to Aragon's eyes, though no less fierce or dangerous. The elf's eyes flashed with furious anger, and when she spoke her voice cracked like a cold whip. "Why, Bram? Why would you spare this coward's life? He does not deserve it." Bram sent her an icy glare. "There are limits, Drurtning. Limits in how far I will go when it comes to killing. Let this be a lesson to you, Aragon, and to you, Murtagh." With that, Bram pressed his heels to Snowfur's sides. The white stallion leapt forward, and the others had no choice but to follow. Sapphira returned to air and flew directly above them, scouting the land for any more dangers that might slow their progress. Aragon looked back to see the shape of the slaver still standing very still, watching them gallop away. "Do you agree with Bram?" He asked her. "I don't know, little one. You humans like to complicate things. Yet I think Brahm was right, and yet Arya also had a point. I would have killed him without thinking of it, but that is a dragon's way. Perhaps it is the wrong way for you two-legs, pointy-eared or not. Perhaps. I don't think Brahm and Arya are going to be able to speak to each other for a little while. No, said Sapphira with an amused chuckle. They tested the limits of who is leading us. It was a conflict that was going to happen sooner or later. I suppose, but I wish it wasn't now. We don't have time for such arguments. After a moment he voiced the question, how is Zoe? Sapphira was silent for a long while. When she spoke, there was a note of worry unusual for a dragon such as her in her voice. Not well, I think. She has stirred a few times, but I sense that her thoughts are troubled. We must hurry. Her time is running out fast. I fear that you and I may have to fly ahead if we do not reach the valley soon. The Varden. You know the dangers that await us there. He was not sure he wished to face not only the scrutiny, but the politics that would try and ensnare them in loyalties and unbreakable oaths. It is face those dangers, she replied grimly, or face capture and imprisonment. From the frying pan into the fire. Eragon turned his attention back to the figure of Brahm in front of him. His sword was back in its sheath, and Eragon could not help but remember the way it had felt to wield Zarok in such a way. If this was any sign of what lay in front of him, then this fight was nothing more than a small skirmish. His stomach turned as he thought of some of the battles that he would no doubt have to fight in. Those would be bloody things that would stretch on for hours and hours until he could barely keep track of which side he was on. Glancing upwards, he took comfort in the sight of Sapphira riding high on the breeze and the knowledge that she would always be with him. Yet looking up at her reminded him of Zoe and of her fate if they did not reach the Varden soon. Urging Kadok onwards with gentle thoughts, Eragon forced himself to think of nothing but the surging horse beneath him and the bright, warm sun on his back. That was enough. He had barely enough strength to think of more, or the man left, alone, on a hillside in the blood of dead men behind them. What was one man when compared to the thought of Urgel soldiers who marched steadily from that direction as well? And so the race continued. Rest was a scarce commodity for all. Added to the exhaustion that they all felt was the coldness between Brahm and Arya after the slaver incident. Neither the elf nor the man could speak with each other, except for brief, terse statements on their course or the Urgels that remained behind them. When they did manage to spit out a sentence, it was so cold and sharp that it made Murtagh and Eragon wince. It was clear that the disagreement between Brahm and Arya went deeper than just leaving the slaver alive. It was a matter of leadership. It had become a matter of what was right and what was wrong. A conflict between justice set down by law and morals. The two brothers did all they could to remain out of the way of the elf and man. The two took turns leading the other's horse so that one of them could sleep while riding. At points they dismounted and ran beside the horses to give them a chance to rest, at least for a little. In those hours that melded into one long stretch of nothing but travel and constant worry, Eragon had never felt closer to Murtagh, the steady presence of his older half-brother giving him a little strength. He would wonder much later if Murtagh had felt the same. The travel, while hard on all of them, was particularly difficult for Brahm. His body just was not up to the stress of little to no sleep and constant riding. Eragon had the feeling that that was why this disagreement between him and Arya was so bitter. The old man was feeling every one of his battle scars, and was of his most foul moods. His face wore a constant glare that, Eragon was sure, could set someone on fire if they dared meet it. They rode through the night, covering league after league in a tireless march. At dawn the next day they were able to navigate their way around the base of one of the bears and through a dense forest before they once more emerged into the open. Only then, as they came out of the trees in the clear light of dawn, could they see the narrow entrance to the valley that eventually led to the dwarves and the Varden. The pass was just under a mile wide and densely forested with the swift, clear river of the Beartooth flowing out of it. In a brief moment of rest before entering the valley, Eragon asked Murtagh if he thought they would be able to throw the Urgels off by slipping into the pass. It was a feeble hope, but it gave the rider a little heart when he desperate for anything that glimmered with a faint speck of hope. It was certainly the simplest way, if only way, of evading the cull and not leading them straight towards the Varden's hideout, because if one brings an army of enemies with them, it is unlikely that one will make any friends with those that are supposed to be their allies. No one would appreciate 100 fully armed cull beating down their door. Murtagh shook his head and said in a low voice, "No, I don't think we can leave them so easily. Think how long they have tracked us. They will follow us as long as they have some sort of trail. It's too bad that Brahm can't cover it with magic, but I don't have the nerve to ask him or Arya. I fear I may end up with a sword through my gut." His voice faded as the young man dropped his head to look at the dark ground. His scarred hands played with a small twig, as if, after the constant movement of riding and running, he could not bring himself to relax and sit still for even a few moments. Iragan smiled grimly at Murtagh's attempt at some humor. "Too true. I think we just have to keep silent and not say anything." Murtagh grunted and no more said. The two brothers returned their thoughts, and then, at a signal from Brahm, they had to return to their uncomfortable saddles and focus on staying upright. That was enough to think about without adding everything else on top. In his mind, never stopping and never lessening in urgency, a small voice whispered, "Hurry, you must hurry." They had just gone a few miles into the steep-sided valley when Saphira contacted Iragan. Her voice was urgent. "The Urgles are gaining on you. They will reach the entrance to the valley soon." Quickly, Iragan relayed the information to the others. The knowledge that the Urgles were slowly but inexorably overtaking them added new urgency to their steps. Trying to assist them in any way she could, Saphira began to drop boulders down on the Urgle army. There were plenty rocks large enough to cause serious damage by the shore of the Beartooth, but it did not slow the Urgles down for long. They kept on with a determination that impressed as well as frightened Iragan. The companions stopped for a brief rest in a clearing just as a few stars appeared high above them. The respite provided Iragan with a chance to check on Zoe, who was still strapped to Saphira. He did so with hesitation, worried that he would find her too far gone for there to be any kind of hope for her. But she was still alive when he checked on her and the straps that secured her to the saddle. Her forehead was, however, dangerously hot, and her eyes wandered uneasily beneath their lids, as if she wished to wake from a nightmare. There were bright red splotches on her white cheeks, and she looked as if she had lost a great deal of weight. Iragan was used to seeing her as someone strong, collected, and always brilliantly alive that, to see her now, made him feel both terribly hopeless and frightened. She was teetering on the edge of death, and while he knew she would not go without a fight, she was fighting a losing battle unless they got the Varden soon. When he told the others of her condition, Arya grimaced and looked away, as if remembering she might have been the one in Zoe's position. "She does not have long. 3 days at most, if that. The fever is a sign that the poison is spreading. We can do nothing for her but ride all the harder." No one said anything. Brahm just continued to glower from underneath his bushy eyebrows. Murtagh scowled darkly as if it might make some sort of difference, and Arya just turned and mounted Melinla's. Iragan gave Saphira a quick embrace before she took to the air again and said, "Let me know if anything changes with Zoe, and keep an eye on the Urgles." "I will, little one. Stay safe. This forest is old, and who knows what wanders in it. These mountains are old, and things that should not have been forgotten have." Iragan nodded before mounting Kadok and following the others from the small clearing. The valley, while narrow, was densely forested with giant, ancient trees that gave off a dark, almost angry air, as if their very presence angered the trees. Running beside them was the fast-flowing Beartooth River. At points, the travelers were forced to follow narrow game trails, often having to dismount to move around dead fall and low-hanging tree branches. No moonlight filtered through the dense branches, and a damp fog rose from the ground, making everything even more murky and unwelcoming. The forest at day was murky enough, but at night it became threatening. The shadows looked like monsters that were about to leap out at them, and strange sounds came from them as if they were being watched by hidden creatures. Occasionally, in the soft ground, Iragan saw the tracks of giant animals, though if any of them were close they chose to stay away, as if sensing the presence of a dragon or merely deciding they weren't worth the effort. In the darkest hours of night, Iragan asked Saphira, "How is Zoe?" "Fading fast," was her grim reply. "Her fever has worsened dramatically, and it is lucky she is strapped in, or she would have fallen off me with all her tossing and thrashing. I cannot ease her mind, for she has not lowered her walls." If we don't get to the Varden by mid-morning, then I will fly ahead with you. We will have to, was Saphira's short reply. Eragon could not help but wonder at fate and the twists it took. Not only was his best friend dying from poison, but they were all running for their lives from Urgles. Not just any Urgles, but Kulwich were the largest of their kind who lived for war and bloodshed. They were the kind of monsters that elders told young children to frighten them and keep them from wandering from their homes. Sighing in exhaustion, Eragon redoubled his speed to keep pace with the others as he ran beside Caddock. The bay gelding was so tried that he barely picked his feet up as he trotted. Eragon had to be careful that the gelding did not stumble on a rock or one of the overly large pine cones that littered the trail. He hated pushing his horse so, but he had no choice. He did his best to convey his gratitude to the horse, and whenever they stopped, he tried to rub away some of the sweat from the gelding's once brilliant red coat. It was mid-morning when Arya said, a note of relief in her lyrical voice, "We are close. Just a little more." Eragon glanced behind them. He could almost swear he heard the sounds of heavy footsteps were those Urgle footsteps. Pulling Caddock along, he tried to pick up speed. The end of their journey gave him new energy, as did the feeling that he was being followed. Half an hour later came a sound that all of them dreaded, the harsh, piercing call of an Urgle horn from behind them. "Hurry!" cried Arya, her voice tinged with desperation. "We are almost there." Somewhere, a part of Eragon thought sarcastically, "Hurry, what does she think we have been doing since Gilead? Sightseeing." It was not long before the sound of a waterfall reached their ears. A thundering, crashing sound that grew louder with every footstep they took along the narrow path between the towering trees. With the last of their strength, they burst forward and broke out onto the rocky shore of a deep, clear blue lake. At long last, they had reached their destination. The lake of Castlemaine was surrounded by high stone cliffs with only a narrow passage on either side that lead to the waterfall. The water crashed and rumbled at the far end of lake, drowning out any sound as it pounded against the rock. The shore of the lake was made up of small, smooth pebbles that were slippery under the horses' hooves and Eragon's boots. The spray from the waterfall made everything sparkle and quickly dampened the travelers with a fine mist of water droplets. But they did not pause to admire the sight of the water or the magnificent waterfall. Taking the lead, Arya led Melinlas around the right side of the thundering falls. The mare whinnied nervously, but did as she was told, vanishing behind a curtain of white spray. It seemed that there was a narrow gap between the rock cliff and the water. Bram followed her, and then Murtagh was next. The young man had to cover Tornak's eyes to convince the horse to trust him. Just as Eragon reached the gap, slipping and sliding on the stones, the sound of a mighty bellow made him turn. The rocks, made slippery by the water, nearly caused him to fall into the water, but he regained his balance and stopped Caddock as he did so. Standing at the edge of the length was a cull. The feeling that he was being followed suddenly made sense. The Urgles had sent out a single runner to keep pace with them until the rest of the army could arrive. Despite himself, Eragon could not help but take a brief moment and admire the cull before him. His horns glittered black, and he stood out against the dark trees with the crystal water at his feet. The cull was both mighty in his size and strength, the sheer brute force combined with a kind of grace that made the cull a nearly unstoppable force. The rider and the cull gazed at each other for a long moment, two enemies meeting in this beautiful, hidden place. Before either the cull or Eragon could do anything, Saphira took matters into her own hands, or in Saphira's case, talons. The blue dragon dived towards the cull, her claws outstretched, as she would do if the Urgle was nothing more than a deer she had hunted down. The cull tried to raise his spear, but Saphira was too fast. She grabbed the creature in her ivory claws and lifted it high into the air. The cull struggled, but one of Saphira's claws pierced his chest and killed him before she dropped the now limp body into the lake. A red stain spread across the clear blue water like a warning. Knowing that they would soon be dealing with more than one cull, Eragon turned quickly and led Caddock through the gap as Saphira followed close behind. She did not bother with the narrow gap, but dived into the clear water and went under the crashing torrent of water. Eragon emerged into a massive cavern whose walls and ceiling was coated in shadow. He was looking at the back of the waterfall now, the blue and white water tumbling and crashing down into the lake before it flowed out in the Beartooth River. Small, Tear-drop lights sent out enough light to illuminate a large door at the far end and the scene before him. For what was happening inside the cavern was what Aragon noticed when he finally managed to pull his eyes away from the massive cavern that he had just found himself in. Brahm, his eyes blazing with fury, was holding the edge of his sword to the neck of a white-robed, bald man. 19. The Varden. Seconds ticked by, but neither Brahm nor the man moved. No one moved. It was hard to breathe and impossible to tear one's eyes away from the event taking place in the center of the room. Soldiers stood nervously around watching as the two men waged a silent, invisible battle. From the look of intense concentration on both of their faces, they were both lost in a mental duel. A vein was bulging in Brahm's forehead from the effort he was spending, and the other man was grimacing as if in pain, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. A thin line of blood was trailing down the bald man's neck and staining the white robe with crimson. The tension on the air was so thick that it made breathing hard, and the roaring water was deafening. In his weariness, Eragon could barely concentrate on more than one thing at a time, and so, when Arya came up to him talking softly with a short, stout, hairy little man who carried an axe in one hand, he almost jumped and pulled his sword out before he realized that they were not enemies. Or at least the short little man could not be an enemy if wait, for that was no man or child. It was a dwarf, the first one Egon had met anywhere but in stories. He came up to Aragon's waist. His thick beard was braided into heavy plaits, and his stout figure spoke of strength and an unyielding personality. The dwarf was shaking his head vigorously at the elf, and Aragon wondered, tiredly, what they were speaking of. But before he could manage to say anything, he was distracted once more by an all-too-familiar noise, the whoosh of an arrow above his head. Reactions that had been honed by fighting, and his already strained nerves made him spin, one hand flying to his sword as he automatically entered a fighting stance. His weight was slightly forward, his muscles ready for immediate action, and his eyes searching for the source of the arrow. The projectile itself was of Urgle make, and had landed just inside the cavern with a clatter. The Urgles must be firing straight at the waterfall, and few lucky arrows were managing to make it inside. Worriedly, Aragon looked towards the soldiers. They would need to act soon, or the Urgles would decide to find out just what lay on the other side of the thundering curtain of water. Saphira had killed the only Urgle to have seen their escape route, but the monsters would soon figure it out and quickly overrun them. The dwarf cursed loudly in a language that reminded Eragon vaguely of rocks cracking against each other, and said, in a booming voice, "By the guards, you just had to bring an army with you, elf." He was glaring at Arya as if the elf princess had purposely brought the Uruks with her just to annoy the dwarf. Arya shrugged, and she did not appear either affronted by the words or amused. Instead, she said rather casually, "I am sorry, Auric. I did not mean to, but certain circumstances have led to this." The dwarf grunted and said, "Elves never take responsibility for the mess they always create." Eragon stared at the dwarf in open shock. He must be a good friend of Arya, for he doubted few would dare say something like that to the elvish princess. Never, in his wildest dreams, would the rider dare speak such words to the proud, cold princess. Raising his battle axe, the dwarf turned to the soldiers and barked, "What are you lot doing? Get to your posts, or you can explain to Ajahad why you let an army of Kull inside Farthendur. Hurry up, or we'll all go to chopping block." His words had an instantaneous effect on the soldiers, who all exchanged nervous looks before hurrying towards some stairs that must have led to their posts. They left Brahm and the bald man in the center of the cavern. The white magician and the old storyteller were still locked in their mental duel. Arya put a hand on the dwarf's shoulder. "Can I leave you with Rider Eragon? One of our companions is in need of healing." Dwarf glanced at Eragon, and the rider had the feeling that he was being evaluated as if he was a particularly interesting tool. Eragon suddenly wished he had the strength to stand on his own 2 feet without leaning against the solid, warm body of Kadok, and that he was not smeared with dried blood, dirt, and sweat. He was quite aware that, at that moment, he bore no resemblance to any kind of rider from the old stories, but a footsore soldier. With a grumbling sigh, the dwarf said, "Go then, elf." He clapped a hand on Arya's lower back, and the force of the blow made the elf stumble slightly on the stony floor of chamber. But you have some explaining to do. Thought you were dead for long enough I started missing our arguments. A grim, almost sad sort of smile made the dwarf's craggy features soften a little. The words made Arya smile slightly, though it quickly faded as she turned to Aragon. Stay here until I return. Her tone booked no argument, and Aragon had no reason to even dream of not doing as she said. He was running on the last of his flagging strength, and was more than willing to stay right where he was with Saphira and his horse. Besides, someone had to watch over Brahm, and the man who had, according to Zoe, betrayed the Varden to the king, and because of this, led to Arya's capture and Saphira's arrival in the spine. Aragon nodded, and with Murtagh's help, undid the straps that held Zoe in place on Saphira. The young woman was limp in their arms. She had stopped tossing and turning in fevered dreams, but she still burned with the fever which only seemed to have risen since Aragon had last checked on her. The few breaths Zoe seemed to be managing came in short, quick gasps while, under Aragon's finger tips, her pulse was thrummed weakly. A dark fear grew inside of the rider as he gazed into her pale, sweaty face. Had they come too late? Yes, she did still draw breath, but she was very weak, and the poison had had a great deal of time to spread. Could a healer, even if they had the antidote, draw her back from the very edge of death? He tried to push the fears away, but he could not stop the hopelessness that rose within him like a choking black cloud. They couldn't lose her after all of this. Almost reluctantly, he passed her over to Murtagh, who then, at a signal from Arya, followed her through the massive door at the end of the hallway. His brother was carrying Zoe's limp body carefully, as though afraid of dropping her. While relieved that Zoe was finally off to the healers, and his brother safely under Arya's command, Aragon could not help but wish that he, too, was off with them. Instead, he was left with 4 exhausted horses, a grumpy-looking dwarf, and a mental duel between the bald man and his father. And me, rumbled Saphira in his mind. And a good thing, too, he said with a faint smile in response, feeling only slightly better as he glanced at his companion. With a hefty sigh, the dwarf who was standing just in front of Aragon said, I'm Auric. The dwarf was leaning against the half of his axe, a weapon that was easily as tall as the dwarf and so heavy-looking that Aragon doubted he would be able to lift it. With a slight bow, Aragon said, Well met, Auric. This is Saphira. The blue dragon twisted her head around to look at Auric and said, Well met, Auric. The dwarf nodded his head in greeting before saying, with an uneasy glance at the 2 men in the center of the room, Brahm. Never thought I'd see him again, but I am glad someone's decided to kill the twins. They deserve the worst punishment possible, especially if they've betrayed us. Nodding in agreement, Aragon said, There are 2 of them. Yes, they came to the Varden offering their magical skill, the backstabbing traitors. The obvious anger in the dwarf's tone spoke of a personal disagreement with the 2 magicians, as well as a great deal of anger at the idea that the 2 had betrayed them all. Choosing not reply, Aragon leaned his head against Saphira's side. He could not offer any assistance to Brahm and could only wait until the duel was decided. At which point, decided the rider, someone had better offer him a bed or he would fall down and sleep on the floor. What an impression that would make. A rider. The first rider for a century who was not allied with the king, asleep on the floor while his father, a rebel leader, dueled silently with a traitor and one of their companions, a girl from another world, was healed from a deadly poison while an elf had supposedly returned from dead, and a son of Morzin fretted over the bedside of the dying girl. Oh yes, what an impression that would make. Arya led Murtagh through a dizzying collection of passages, doors and stairs, and not once did they encounter anyone. Perhaps that was the point of the route Arya took, but Murtagh could not help but wonder if there was anyone inside this massive, hollow mountain. It was eerily silent and deserted. Their footsteps echoed on the stone passages and floors hollowly. Finally, after so many twists and turns and staircases that Murtagh lost count of them all, they reached a long, circular-shaped corridor. It was the first corridor on which doors led off on either side, and at regular intervals on the corridor. Teardrop lights cast their bright light across the walls. In their clear light, Murtagh was suddenly aware of how filthy he was and how desperately in need of a good bath and change of clothes. Dried blood, flaking off in brown flecks, covered his gloved hands, and he could only imagine what his face looked like. He doubted that, at any time before this, he had ever been this filthy or disheveled. He had, after all, been raised as nobility, and even during the past few months of travel, they had never been so far away from a source of water that he couldn't remove the worst of the grime. But now, well now, he was sure, he not only looked terrible, but smelled terrible. Arya marched onwards to the largest door at the end of the hall, and he followed with the unconscious Zoe in his arms. Without breaking stride, the elf pushed the door open with her shoulder to reveal a long white-walled room with beds along one side and cabinets on the other. At the end was a balcony, but curtains were half drawn across it, and they blocked the view it overlooked. It was brightly lit and immaculate. As they stepped inside, their footsteps rang in the silence, and there was not a single healer in sight. This did not seem to bother Arya, who gestured at one of the empty, white-sheeted beds. The elf was moving towards one set of cabinets, and her face was set in a kind of determination that made Murtagh wonder if she actually knew what she was doing. Gently, Murtagh placed Zoe on the white, soft bed on which she looked not only even paler, but small against the white sheets and white walls. The young woman was so still and pale that Murtagh could have mistaken her for a statue had it not been for the faint rise and fall of her chest. Fear, no terror, began to claw at his heart. This was Zoe, his friend and ally. The fears were growing, and it took all of Murtagh's considerable self-control to force it all away. Fear had no place in his heart. It never had, nor would it any time soon, especially when it would do nothing to save the quickly fading girl before him. Forcing himself to look away, he saw Arya rummaging in one cabinet as she searched for something. But before he could speak, the door at the end of the long, high-ceilinged room burst open to reveal one of the oddest-looking people Murtagh had ever seen. Her hair was bright red and curled every which way, while her clothes were a rough assortment of patches that made her look a little like some sort of circus tent. In fact, she looked like someone one might see at a circus. Was this a Varden healer? He was barely able to restrain his skepticism as he gazed at the women with eyes that ached with exhaustion. In an irritated voice, the woman said, "Good Lord, Arya, what do you think you are doing?" Her hands were planted solidly on her wide hips, and she was glaring at the elf as if Arya were a child about to take a cookie from a cookie jar when she had been expressly told not to. A memory suddenly surfaced in Murtagh's mind as he studied the face of this strange, new arrival. Was it? Could it be? He thought he remembered this woman's face bent over him as he lay on a bed, his back hurting with fiery intensity, when he was still a young child who hadn't quite realized the fate that he had been given just because of his parentage. This was the healer that had saved him after Morzan had nearly killed him. He could still her, for it was her murmuring soothing words as he drifted in and out of consciousness, the gentleness of her hands as she bathed his fevered face with cool clothes. If she was here to help Zoe, perhaps there was hope for her after all. He knew well what skill this healer possessed. He was living testament to it. Turning around quickly, Arya bowed her head in respect, a move that surprised Murtagh, and said, "I am searching for the antidote for Zoe. Why are you here, Angela?" "Why do you think?" snapped Angela. "I am saving this girl's life. I tell her to be careful, but does she listen? No." With that, Angela drew a vial of some black liquid from a sleeve, and seeing Murtagh, she made shooing motions towards the balcony. She didn't even bother with a greeting or any sign of recognition, as if they had not spent weeks together all those years ago. "Get gone with you, Murtagh. I can't have you hanging around here. You can wait on the balcony until I say you can see her, and don't you dare try to disobey me." Even all these years after the last time he had heard that voice, it still inspired quick results, even though his heart longed to stay by Zoe's side and make sure that she did actually make it through to morning. But he could not. That healer was not one to cross, and he would not delay Zoe's healing by being stubborn. Moving as quickly as he could in his weary, sore state, Murtagh went to the balcony. He had long since decided that he would rather face Cull than incur the wrath of that particular healer. Her tongue could be as sharp as his sword, and yet she was also one of the few people in his life that had never tried to use him. No, he trusted that healer as much as he could ever trust anyone, even if she did make him feel like a young child being told to leave the adults to their talks. The balcony at the end of the healing hall was as wide as the chamber, and there were a few reclining chairs and cushioned chairs that looked like heaven to his travel-sore body. The balcony overlooked a city, a busy dwarven city of shining marble. At another time, if he had more energy or his heart was not so torn, he might have admired the view and the wondrous city of white marble in the center of a hollow mountain. But he had neither the heart nor energy to wonder or gaze in awe at this wonder of dwarven skill. The healing hall was quite a bit higher than the city, set into the side of the mountain that surrounded the city, but it gave Murtagh a rather excellent view of the buildings, markets, gardens, streets, twisting alleys and courtyards that made up Trondheim. The stories he had heard did not do justice to what the dwarves had accomplished by creating this hollowed-out city. He noted that rather distantly as he sunk into one of the cushioned chairs that looked too comfortable to pass up. Despite his best attempts to stay awake and aware of his surroundings, he quickly found himself drifting off to sleep. He was too tired, too strung out emotionally to keep himself awake any longer. One hand firmly fixed on the hilt of his sword and the other on a hidden knife, the young man fell into the first true sleep he had for a long, long time. A light breeze ruffled his sweaty, blood-matted hair, and his face relaxed as he was pulled into a deep, black sleep. For once he did not dream. He just slept in the quiet peace of the balcony, dead to the world. Can you save her, Angela? Looking at the pale, still girl Arya was about as hopeful for her chances of survival as she was of the dwarves giving up their guards. Zoe had been under the influence of the poison for close to 2 weeks, and the constant travel would not have helped matters. She was only human after all, and unlike an elf or rider, she did not have the endurance or the healing abilities. If she lived, it would be by pure luck and Angela's skill. The girl's hair looked even darker against her pale face and the white sheets. Angela shot her a dark look before saying snappily, "If you can't say anything worth my attention, then leave, princess. I am not here to listen to your pessimism. If Zoe dies on my watch, then I will be in for a tongue lashing like you wouldn't believe." Wisely choosing to say nothing, Arya continued to gently bathe Zoe's sweaty brow with a cool cloth. Angela had given the girl the antidote, but trying to lower the girl's fever and remove the poison that still flowed through her veins was a complex business. Angela had had Arya busy, mixing a number of different herbal remedies, before then setting the elf the task of keeping Zoe's fever down with cold clothes. Basic things that, according to the herbalist, was all Arya was good for when it came to matters of healing. At one point, 3 of the Varden's healers had arrived, but were sent packing by Angela, who told them that they barely deserved the title of healer and to go be useful somewhere else. Thank you very much. Privately, Arya agreed with the herbalist that the Varden's healers would not be able to help Zoe. They were used to battle injuries, not complex, deadly poisons, but they did serve a purpose, and without them, the Varden would have lost many a warrior over the years. At last Angela sighed and sat down heavily on an empty bed. Running a hand through her curly red hair, the herbalist said tiredly, "I can do nothing more for her. Whether she lives or not is up to greater powers than I can command. You may go, Arya. I will stay with her." Arya nodded and rose from her chair, leaving the rag in the bowl of cold water on the bedside table. Before turning to leave, she said, "Send for me when Murtagh wakes. I do not want him wandering around until we have spoken with Ajihad." The herbalist nodded and said, "I am glad to see him out in the open again." "One more thing," said Arya, turning to look back at Angela, for the question had been burning on the tip of her tongue for so long she could resist voicing it. "Why is Zoe so important? What has she done that makes you run to her aid? What does she do to make everyone run to her aid? I am growing sick of this endless circle of questions, and you, Angela, are not someone who acts with a purpose or without some sort of important reason. Why, oh why?" The herbalist grinned widely, her eyes glittering with mischievous humor, as if the question and the open thoughts that Arya wore in her green eyes were amusing because, to her, the answer was so simple and obvious. In a low voice that seemed heavy with meaning to the elf, the herbalist asked, "What hasn't she done would be a better question, Arya." With that, the herbalist drew out her knitting from some hidden pocket in her patchwork of brightly colored clothing and began clacking away, creating some sort of knitted creation that would, no doubt, do something completely obscure or useless. On the bed, the young woman, Zoe, lay completely still and silent as she drifted between life and death. Knowing better than to engage in a duel of half-answers when she was this tired, Arya left the healing hall. She walked back to where she had left Eragon, Brahm, Saphira, Auric, and the horses. Knowing the way back to the entrance cavern like the back of her hand, she allowed her thoughts to return to the confusing, contradicting person that was Zoe. Brahm was holding back when it came to her, as was Murtagh, Eragon, and Saphira. Not that they had much chance to discuss it, but they had even been vague about how they met her. Why? For what reason did they shroud her in secrecy? Was it just another thing that Brahm expected no one to question? Then there was Zoe herself to consider. From what she had heard, Zoe was brave, logical, and clear-headed, as well as a dangerous opponent and a loyal friend. She was enough of a beauty that she attracted attention and dangerous enough to pose a threat to Durza. She was far from any kind of mortal normal. Then there was her information on the most secret inner workings of the Empire. As she drew close to the door that led to the entrance cavern, Arya pushed her thoughts away. They were leading her nowhere but round and round in an endless circle. The only way to find the answers she sought was to speak with the girl privately, if she lived, and if she did not, then she would confront Brahm about the matter. It was time for some true answers, but for now she had to deal with the present. Squaring her shoulders, schooling her features into a blank mask, the elvish ambassador pushed the door open. She was not sure what she would find on the inside, but she would be damned if she wasn't prepared for anything. Arya was not one to let battles to be sprung on her, but be ready for any fight no matter what kind. The heavy metallic scent of blood met her first, followed by the sight of Eragon, still standing by Saphira with the 4 horses, and then Brahm, bloody sword in one hand, talking with the tall, dark-skinned Ajahad. A far different scene from the one she had left. The twin magician who Brahm had been dueling when she left was lying dead a little ways away from the 2 men. Auric was there, as well as 10 of Ajahad's personal guards, who were all standing a little ways back, looking rather uncomfortable in the strange situation they had found themselves in. Arya met Eragon's eyes briefly before she gathered herself together and strode forward, speaking in a clear voice as she did so. Ajahad. The leader of the Varden turned to face her, a rare smile lighting up his face as his almond eyes swept over her, as if not quite believing that it was actually her. In his deep, controlled voice, the man said warmly, "It gladdens my heart to see you again. We discovered what had happened. We feared the worst for both you and the egg." He stepped forward and gave Arya a quick, tight embrace in a rare show of open affection. The man was not known for displaying his feelings in such a way, and the elf wondered slightly at his joy and open relief. Had she been missed this much because she was Arya, or because she was the queen's daughter and the ambassador? Questions for another time. Allowing a small smile, Arya said, "Indeed, it is only because of Brahm, Murtagh, Zoe, Eragon, and Saphira that I was able to escape the Empire with my life." Frowning slightly, and ever one to get straight to the point, Ajahad asked, "Did you give the Empire any information?" "Brahm has explained to me a little of the adventures surrounding Eragon and Saphira, but he has not told me anything of you yet, or the details surrounding your capture and imprisonment." Arya inwardly sighed. She did not want to deal with this right now. She wanted to sleep in a soft bed and forget for a little while the things she had experienced, but as seemed her lot in life, she had to deal with other things first. "No, Ajahad, I did not. However, I would prefer to speak of matters later when my thoughts are not clouded. Brahm." Here she paused and met the tired eyes of the old storyteller. The man had never looked so haggard to the elf, but there was nothing she could do to help him, and she was still rather annoyed with him after the way he had confronted her. "Angela is caring for Zoe, and I left Merc with her." Brahm nodded and sheathed his sword. Ajahad looked curious at the mention of their 2 companions. No doubt he had heard enough about Murtagh to guess at who he really was, and enough about Zoe to make him deeply curious about whom she really was. But the man said nothing about it at that moment, as if he sensed such questions were not only amiss at such a time, when Zoe might not live the night, and would not be answered in any kind of completion because of exhaustion. The commander, tall and completely in control of himself, turned to Eragon and Saphira. He said, "Auric will show you to the dragon hold where you can rest as long as you want." Eragon inclined his head and passed the reins of the horses to a waiting soldier before following Auric out of the cavern. Before leaving, he glanced behind and looked at Arya, his gaze troubled and weary. Arya smiled at him, trying to offer some reassurance to the rider, but knowing she could not ease any of his worries that day. They would have to wait to see if their desperate ride was worth it not only for Zoe, but for giving the Varden fair warning of the battle rapidly approaching. Turning her attention back to Brahm and Ajahad, she bade them farewell for now. She was eager to escape before she was roped into anything or asked to explain anything more. As she hurried through the passages that led to the city, and then to the rooms that would still be kept ready for any elvish guests should they need them, she couldn't stop thinking of not only the past few weeks, but those who were not with her. Glenwing. Loyal and gentle Glenwing, who had been such a dear friend to her, and even more painfully, Phelan. Her Phelan who she had no. She would not think of any of that. She had sworn not to think of that. With ruthless determination, the elf told her inner self that she would sleep, and she would enjoy the soft bed and comfortable rooms that were so much nicer than cold ground or the back of a moving horse. She would think of all that later. For she was not currently fighting for her life like Zoe, or about to be thrust into the spotlight like Eragon and Saphira. But his name still haunted the shadows of her mind and filled her with cold sadness, no matter how hard she tried to avoid thinking about it. 20. Discovery. I knew I was dreaming. What else could this be? It was one of those disjointed memories, frozen moments, which did not fit in with the rest of my ordinary, modern life. It was one of those frozen snapshots that made me feel as if I was standing on the edge of a cliff of almost understanding, almost knowing what the hell was going on, but not quite because the answer remained just out of reach. I was standing in the throne room that I had seen. Only this time I was standing in front of one of the small thrones on the raised dais. The hall was even larger than I had thought. There was no sound, and everything seemed frozen as if someone had hit the pause button. The room was crowded with people wearing formal robes and dresses of many colors, their hair, necks, and wrists adorned with sparkling jewels. Everyone was looking up at us, bright smiles on their faces, and the air seemed to shimmer with laughter and celebration. It was a sight to remember. My eyes scanned the crows, trying to memorize every detail, as I realized that I was one of the main attractions. I glanced down and realized that I, too, was wearing a gown. It was dark blue with silver embroidery, and probably one of the most beautiful things I had ever worn. My heart skipped a beat as I caught sight of myself in one of the tall windows. A silver circlet was interwoven in my hair. I looked like royalty. Every single aspect of my reflection was flawless, from my elegantly done hair to the dress that fell in soft folds around me and somehow made me look both older and more attractive than I ever did normally. I felt so bloody self-conscious, though. Even as I stood there, tall and seemingly relaxed, I felt the weight of all those eyes. But it felt right. As if this was a normal thing, something I was used to and learned to bear long ago. I glanced to my left and saw Eamund, also dressed in silvery finery, looking forward, his face set in a noble-looking frown. He too looked a little uncomfortable, as if he, like me, disliked being the center of the room. A fine silver circlet rested atop his dark head, crowning him as if he was a prince. His serene and kind grey eyes hid any emotion he might be feeling at that moment. I hoped I looked as composed as he did. To my right, standing in front of the two largest thrones, were two regal people. The sight of them made something stir within me, a distant memory of shared laughter and love that sent a shooting pain through my heart. It was a kind of grief and loss that confused me even more, for it was far deeper than any I had ever felt before. It was as if I had lost these people long ago, and the pain was still sharp and fresh, all too willing to be remembered and send a dagger through me. The man, the king, was golden-haired, and his blue eyes danced with laughter and a wise kind of kindness. He was tall, and his sole presence seemed to emanate an aura of royalty and authority. His rich formal robes were a deep wine color, and a circlet of gold only added to the feeling that this was a king. A long sword was sheathed at his side, and one of his calloused hands rested on the simple, wire-wrapped hilt. A warrior king. His blue eyes were infinite, like an ever-expanding clear blue sky, deep, so vast that I felt as I could fall into them. In those eyes I felt safe, secure as if he gave me an anchor on which I could be grounded. But my eyes moved on to the other figure who was, without doubt, his queen. She was black-haired, and her face was so delicate, so defined, that she had to be one of the fairest people I had ever seen. Her grey-blue eyes reminded me of Eamon's, and I suppose my own. There was an air of power about her that was more than just her beauty or the authority she seemed to command in the way she stood and looked out at the crowd. It was a power that flickered in her eyes and seemed to shine through her like a bright light that could never be dimmed. I felt a wave of emotion wash over me. I did not know what it was, but deep in the eyes of the queen gleamed a touch of familiarity, of love that I knew and would have done anything to feel again. I knew, as clearly as I knew my name, that I had seen this woman and this man many times before. I remembered those eyes. It seemed strange, almost like I could not trust it, but also real and comforting. But it felt like I was coming back, returning to a home that I had never really forgot. My eyes moved on to the last two thrown, as if I were searching for some sort of reassurance that I was only dreaming. Only dreaming. But no such reassurance came, for in front of them stood two golden-haired, blue-eyed people also dressed in rich finery. One of them was a boy, a few years older than me, who seemed to glow with a brilliant kind of fire, of strength that was tempered by nobility. His blue eyes were unreadable, perfectly composed, but also noble and gentle. The golden circlet looked right on his head, completely natural, and not as if someone had stuck it there like mine felt. Beside him was a young woman, her eyes glittering with a slight glint of mirth, and a small smile dancing on her lips. Her long platinum hair had been intricately braced, and her dress was a pure pearl color with intricate silver embroidery that made it look like it had been frosted with snow. She looked as if she found love and laughter wherever she went. She was a golden princess from a fairy tale whose gentle smiles and hands were as at home at an embroidery hoop as they were when aiding the poor or infirm. So beautiful in her golden glow that any man might have lost his head to her in a single here beat. The sight of them made my heart twinge painfully, and distant memories of pranks, of wild adventures and fun filled me with sadness, as if I had lost something that I held dear and had guarded with my life only to fail when it mattered most, flickered through my mind. Everything about those five people was so familiar, and yet so new. I did not remember their faces, did not remember their voices, but I remembered their presence. I wanted to cry. I wanted to shout my questions and get an answer, but I could not move or speak. The dream faded, and I was sent into another one, a wide open prairie of gently waving golden grass above which a glittering blue sky stretched out endlessly. I was mounted on a white horse with no saddle or bridle, and my bow was in my right hand. The warmth of the horse between my legs and smooth wood of my weapon was familiar, deeply comforting to my troubled thoughts. I had been happy here, carefree and contented with where I was and who I was. From beside me, a voice said, "What do you think, Zoe?" I turned and saw the golden-haired boy who was also mounted. His blue eyes shone with laughter, and he raised one hand pointing into the distance. "Last one to the rocks loses." And we were gone, racing our fleet horses across the grass and laughing away our cares and worries to the breeze. The scene shimmered and was replaced by the inside of a cave. A woman was standing in front of me. Her face was ageless, full of wisdom and kindness, but also a deep, ancient kind of power that overwhelmed me in its intensity. One of her hands was on my shoulder. In a gentle voice she spoke, "Good luck, Zoe. You will come back when the time is right, and your memories will as well. Hold true to yourself, daughter of Angard." Blackness seized me and sent me spinning into a familiar room, my old bedroom from boarding school. My mother was with me, and I realized it was the first day of junior high when everyone was dropped off for the school term. It was my first year at Laurenville, and I was feeling like everything I had ever known was slipping away. She was dressed, as she always did, fashionably and perfectly. Not a single strand of her dyed hair was out of place, and her Hermes scarf was perfectly arranged. Her black handbag casually resting on one arm as she turned to walk out the door, as if relieved to finally be able to go live her social, high-profile life without worrying about her daughter. Safe and sound off at an expensive, popular boarding school. She paused at the door and looked back, her steely grey ones meeting my own. In her twangy New York accent, she said, "Enjoy while you have the chance." The dream broke, and I was drifting, vaguely aware of flying, of words spoken outside my mental barricades, and the overwhelming sense of urgency that made me restless within my trance. But this was all vague, far away, and I could not have told you where I was or what my purpose was. These dreams were brief things, pulling me away from the darkness for a little while, and then dropping me back into it. I knew not how long I was cut loose of all the things around me before I heard a voice gently calling my name. It started off as a gentle murmur and then gained volume and intensity. Zoe. It echoed through my mind. Zoe. It seemed to be asking me to follow it like a tantalizing promise of freeing myself from this trance. Summoning what remained of my determination and strength, I followed the voice's call. It led me through memories, feelings, and thoughts as if I was traversing a twisting path, and it was my map, my light, and my reason to go on. Zoe. It called again when I stumbled or my strength flagged. Zoe. I was waking. I was slowly becoming aware of my body and the world, or at least my consciousness woke from my dream state. I was standing in a warm, sunlit study wearing a light gold and white dress. When I looked down at myself, I realized I was slightly transparent. I wasn't really here, but rather my mind or soul, or you get the idea. My body, battered and dying, was still in Alagaesia, but my mind had escaped it for a little while. It was a welcome escape. I examined the quiet, comfortably furnished room. Glass-fronted bookcases lined the overly tall walls, and I longed to settle down in one of the comfortable-looking chairs and read to my heart's content. Tall windows overlooked an open expanse of green country that rose up into towering mountains. A claw-footed desk, stacked high with papers and half-read books, was in the center of the room. Sitting at the desk, brow furrowed in concentration, one hand tapping the desk, was Eamund. He was gazing at a piece of paper, looking as if it was some sort of difficult math problem. He looked less noble, less untouchable there, instead of the grand throne room like the last time I had met him. But there was still an air of power about him, and his elegant robes were soft blue embroidered with patterns of leaves, elegant and beautifully tailored. The silver circlet was abandoned on a stack of books and scrolls, but he did not need it to seem regal and powerful. His grey eyes were hard at first sight, impenetrable and guarded by an iced wall that held back whatever he might be feeling. Clearing my throat and stepping forward slightly, I said, "Eamund." To my amusement, he leapt straight up in surprise. The paper he was holding went flying, and Eamund's hand went to the small letter opener that was a pitiful excuse for a weapon. His eyes found mine and widened in surprise, the hard crystal barrier suddenly vanishing in his shock, and he looked younger suddenly, his royal facade vanishing at the sight of me. It was most gratifying to see his jaw drop and form a small O before he snapped it shut. I could not help it. I laughed. I laughed, the first true laugh since before Gilead and Durza put a damper on any joy I might experience. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. His eyes were edged with sorrow and pain, but there was also joy and relief, as if the sight of me freed him of the heaviest burden. He didn't seem quite able to believe that it was me, standing right in front of him, and smiling as if I knew exactly who he was and who I was. A silence had fallen over the large office, and I would have liked to say so many things, and deep down, an instinct was telling me to do something, anything. Suddenly, a place inside of me that I hadn't even known about felt complete, as if the sight of this man was a missing piece, that I had lived for so long without that I had forgotten about it. I could feel the tears gathering in my eyes, and they were starting to blur my vision, and nothing I could do could stop them from beginning to streak down my cheeks. Irman's eyes narrowed in worry and alarm, moving forward from behind his desk, and he reached me only to have me, acting on some strange impulse, throw my arms around him. My tears were already rolling down my cheeks, and his strong, warm arms were so comforting, so right. I felt at home in his embrace. I felt as if I had just fallen back into the warmth of familiarity, even though I did not know this person. I pressed my face against his formal robes, and he held me tightly. I drew back a little and looked up into his silvery gaze. He was crying too, I realized suddenly, and he was trembling with emotion. This strong, noble young man was just as affected as I was by this meeting. Eamund rested one hand on the side of my cheek and whispered, "Zoe, oh Zoe." He said it as if he needed to say it 1,000 times to actually believe the truth that it was me, ordinary little me, standing before him. An instinct made me gently brush away his tears with my thumb. I struggled to steady myself, to slow the sobs and try to answer the thousands of questions. Everything about this room was strange, but also familiar, for somewhere, floating on the edges of my memory, were the other times I had sat here and looked out of those windows, wishing I was just another person in the crowd, or longing for days when life was simple. Other times. Times where I knew exactly who I was, what I needed to do, and who to trust. "I do not know anything about this," I whispered as I searched for an answer in his eyes. "I don't remember you, you know me, but I do not know you." "I know," he whispered, "that I am a stranger to you." He said it as if the words hurt him worse than any physical injury ever had, his voice soft, edged with sadness and grief that I wished I understood. "But I am your younger brother. It was lucky that Eamund was holding me. It was lucky that he was, because the words came as such a shock that I doubt I could have stood on my own. My brother. I had a brother. This was my brother. I suppose I could see it even as my heart had always known it. We had the same eyes, the same hair, and the same narrow build. But still, this was my brother. I didn't remember having a brother, someone to tease, care for, laugh with, play pranks with, or do anything of things that siblings do. "Brother," I whispered. "Yes," he said, and his eyes gleamed with pain. "Sister." He took my hand and drew me to the elegant couch, pushing me down so that we both sat together, his arm wrapped around my shoulder and the other gripping my hand tightly as if he could never imagine letting go. "I had hoped that you would just remember on your own. It's not fair, any of it. Can you explain?" I asked. My voice was barely audible, but steadier than I had imagined it would be. "You look like mother," said Eamund as he glanced away for a moment. "Not a day older than when you left. I believed you were dead, dead and gone." I gently rested a hand on his cheek and asked again, "Can you explain, please?" For a long moment he didn't seem able to speak, and then he nodded as he drew himself back together. "I will start at the beginning, but I know, little sister. Some answers you shall have to find on your own. You see, well, you of this world, my world, this one." I restrained myself from speaking, for I could see the pain in Eamund's eyes, and I did not want to make it any more difficult for him. "The life you think you lived on Earth isn't true. You belong here and always have. You must forget that world. What happened there, it's not who you are or where you belong. Not Alagaesia or Earth. This world." I buried my face in his shoulder, and for a moment we just sat there, his arms around me, as I tried to come to terms with his words. My voice muffled by the soft fabric, I whispered, "Please explain, Eamund." Slowly, so I caught every heavy word he spoke, Eamund said into my hair, "About a year ago, you were sent through a crack or portal between this world and Earth. There are few portals like this. No one knows why or how they came into existence, and they connect worlds with each other. The portal that you used was a gateway to Earth. There are powers that govern the gateways. They took your memories, substituted others, and gave you a life on Earth. They created an entire life for you, all the cares, joys, experiences, and knowledge that a girl from Earth would have. They even changed your appearance a little so you could pass off as those two people's child. No one knew what happened to you for 6 months until Lucia, our younger sister, had a dream. In the dream, she met a woman. I suppose she was some sort of goddess, one of the powers who govern the gateways and choose you as their fighter. It was she who told Lucia what had happened to you. She explained that you would eventually return, but your skill was needed elsewhere." Eamund took a brief pause and then continued, as if he was delivering a report and not telling his older sister just who she was and all the things she had to remember. "It has been difficult for all of us not having you." Eamund let out a shuddering breath and continued as if desperate to have it all over with. "Then the goddess returned. She came to me in a dream and explained that you were now in a world called Alagaesia and of the challenges you faced. It was she who showed me how to contact you when you were unconscious after Gilead, and the information I was to pass on to you." I drew my face out of his robes and managed to nod my head. Suddenly, at that moment, everything seemed to click into place. True, I had spent time as Zoe of Earth. It had been my only identity, and this came as a great shock to find out that that was not true. But that Zoe seemed so far away now. I would never return to Earth or boarding school or the mother that was not really my mother. I was more than that girl. I would always remain Zoe, but I no longer needed her and her life to hide behind. I was ready to find out who I truly was, and most important, I had found a brother in Eamund. I had found that I had a father, a mother, a sister and brothers when I thought I had none. Who are they? I asked, and Eamund understood as if he could read my mind with his Farseeing grey eyes. You are younger than me, right? Pated is the eldest, and he is noble and all that one would want in a high king. Then you, he smiled a little, then me, and then Lucia, who is beautiful and delicate. Eamund's smile broadened, and he was looking at me desperately as if hoping I would remember now. But I didn't. While his words made me smile despite everything, there were still names of people I didn't remember ever knowing. I wished that I did remember being a part of it, part of the stories and the memories that I knew were somewhere in my mind, but out of reach still. With a small, sad sigh, Eamund continued heavily, and any smile or joy left us both quickly. Our mother has been dead for the last 6 years, and our father for 3. The memory of the golden-haired, blue-eyed girl and the tall, golden-haired warrior from my dreams flashed across my mind. So those were my family, all of us, gathered like royalty. Who are we? I asked. What are we? Eamund smiled slightly. Our brother is the High King of our world, just as those before him have been the High King. Since being sent to Alagaesia, you have begun to look more like you did when you lived here. He brushed a strand of my dark hair away from my face. You look my sister now. They had to make you as inconspicuous as possible so you would fit in on Earth, but now you are finding the strength that all those of our house have. I had not had a chance to really look in a mirror recently, but if I lived to do so, I would be interested to see the changes my brother spoke of. I would be more than interested. I was desperate to see them. As for your other family, Eamund paused, as if it hurt him to ever think of me having another family. From what the goddess told me, they don't even remember having a daughter. You no longer exist in that world. It is as if you were never there. They do not remember you, and so they cannot miss you. No one there can. I nodded. What more could I do? On one hand, it made sense. I had assumed I was growing because of the challenges I had faced traveling with Iragan, but I was actually discovering the person I had been before Earth. Before my memories were blocked and replaced by false ones, the person who was confident, who could focus in dangerous situations, and was not intimidated by those with power or status. It also explained why I could withstand the poison like I have. I was not an ordinary human. It explained everything that had mystified me. My visions were flashes of true memories, and my skills had been earned when I still lived here. Yet, well, there was my old family. Hard to get along with they were, but they had loved me in their own way and I them. To lose them, to be forgotten by them, because some power slipped me into their life and then yanked me out was cruel. It hurt and I could not just suddenly forget them like they had been forced to forget me. I would always remember them, and that was as it should be. I had long ago said farewell to them, and now I had to fill that empty space with those who really were my family, Pated, Eamund, and Lucia. I felt a wave of guilt and shame as I remembered the dark-haired queen from the dream. I had not recognized my own mother, and I felt as if I had betrayed her by loving someone else instead. Because I hadn't known any better, and yet that is what the young woman had been to me, and I had not known that there was someone else. I suddenly felt very tired. I was so glad for the warmth of Eamund's embrace and the soft couch we sat on together. My brother and IIT was strange and wondrous all at once. What will happen now, Eamund? I'm not really here. I still might die, brother. I still might never get to remember all the things I know about you and this world that is my home. I might never ever have the chance. Eamund's eyes hardened with determination. You will return. I know you will. His words gave me a little confidence, but we were both clutching at straws, both of us desperate to try and find some hope that I would get the chance to remember and have the homecoming that Eamund clearly dreamed of. Desperate to change the subject, I asked gently, can you tell me more about myself? All the things you remember. Eamund's eyes glittered in the warm, sunny light that streamed from the windows. Somehow I knew that my question was some sort of comfort to him. Of course, he said with a wide smile, Pethard and Lucia will be furious that I got to speak with you and they didn't." The air felt lighter, as if we were slowly settling back into our old relationship. It would take time, I knew that, but I already felt comfortable and confident in Eamund's presence, part of me already accepting him back into the place he had once occupied. I laughed a little at his words and tried to imagine the golden-haired prince glaring at Eamund or the pale gold princess with her hands on her hips in anger. "You were always there for me," said Eamund with a faint smile. "Always there for all of us, and you have always been the voices of reason. We've all missed you. Everyone who knew you has missed you these past months." I smiled and wished I remembered this. I wished I remembered the girl who he spoke of and could just be her instantly again. A sudden question occurred to me and I voiced it without thinking. "Eamund, why was I chosen by these powers? Why did they need someone at all? What is the purpose of this?" Eamund shrugged, and any sign of happiness vanished from his face. "They said that your abilities were what they needed for this quest. They sent you to Earth for you to learn of Aragan and Saphira's journey, and for you to learn certain skills. Apparently the worlds are connected by a thin link, a kind of curtain that separates them, but also allows for the transfer of ideas, stories, and inventions. There are gateways that people can use to travel between the worlds, but they are hard to use and even harder to find. These doorways are being threatened by Galbatorix and his magic. He discovered them and wants to use them to expand his empire and discover new technologies that he could use against his enemies. The powers sent you to help stop him before he can do something that would destroy the delicate balance between the worlds. If this balance is disrupted, then Alagaesia and any other world connected to it by a gateway will fall. So I did have a purpose. A rather big, intimidating purpose that made part of me cower and part of me feel lighter, stronger and more determined than ever because now I knew. A purpose, however difficult or challenging, is 1,000 times better than indecision. I smiled a little to try and reassure my brother, though I am sure he saw through it. "Thank you, Eamund." I meant those words with all the sincerity, all the love I had within myself. He nodded and smiled weakly. "I hope you haven't gotten yourself over your head, sister dear." "Me?" I teased lightly. "Never. It's you who gets yourself buried in quicksand faster than I can say, Eamund." Before I could say anything more, I felt a light tugging in my mind that grew stronger with every passing moment. I sighed. It seemed my time here was up, and I saw that Eamund seemed to know this too. His eyes met mine sadly, and he rose, gently pulling me up to. A desperate wish rose inside of me as I met Eamund's kind, clear eyes, suddenly so reachable and present in a way that was more comforting than anything else I could have imagined. "You will tell them, won't you? Tell them that I will come back, not to worry too much about me." Eamund understood. He gave me a smile and nodded. The room around me began to fade, but my eyes were fixed on my brother's face. The grey-blue eyes, just like mine, the black hair and the proud way he held himself, the stubborn loyalty, the nobleness and the tinge of sadness from all that he had seen and endured. My brother, my wonderful younger brother. It was all there, and how I wished I did not have to leave again, but I had no choice. How I loved him. How I loved him even though I did not remember him. "Love you, Zoe," he whispered into my hair as I felt myself slipping away into the blackness. "Come home." I did not linger in the dark for as long as I had before. It seemed to be the day of voices, for after what could have been seconds or hours, I heard another voice calling for me. It was a voice that sounded rather familiar and also impatient, terribly impatient. It took a great deal of effort, but I managed to force myself upwards, back into the real world. With a sigh, I forced my eyes open. They were like heavy shutters that, when opened, shadowed my mind with light. I blinked rapidly a few times to clear the sunspots before I was clearly able to see the face looking down at me. A stern frown on her face, curly hair going every which direction, and looking like some sort of crazed person was the last person I expected to see. Angela, the herbalist. Her voice irritated and her eyes flashing, she snapped. "Really, girl? Why do you do this yourself? I've spent the last 6 hours trying to bring you back from death's door. I think you won't cover it." I would have liked to say something, but I couldn't summon the energy or the words. My mouth was paper dry mouth. My head hurt terribly, and my body ached as if I had just recovered from a bad bout of flu. The herbalist held a glass of water to my dry lips, and I drank thirstily. Water had never been this refreshing. When I had drunk my fill, the herbalist turned her gaze to mine. Her voice softening a little, she said, "You need to rest for a little longer, Zoe. When you wake again, you will be ready to leave." I sighed tiredly, already slipping back into sleep. Before I could completely loose myself to the darkness, Angela said, "I hope that Eamund is well." My eyes shot open. Had I had more energy, I would have leapt up, but all I could was gasp out, "You know Eamund? You knew all along, didn't you?" Why hadn't I seen it? The herbalist had known all along. What did she know of me? Who was she really? Putting a hand on my shoulder, the herbalist said sternly, "Calm yourself, Zoe. I do know of your history, but I cannot speak of it. I swore an oath not to tell you anything. You have to discover it on your own. The memories will come back faster now, I think, and soon you will know all that you did before." I met her gaze. "Just who are you, Angela?" My voice was soft, but demanding in its softness. It was time for Angela to admit a little of her secrets, but I was weak and ill, and sleep was tugging at my mind. I struggled against it as I met the herbalist's gaze. Angela just smiled crookedly, but her eyes spoke of ageless wisdom and sadness. Never had I seen such a look, and it made me feel like a young child who had seen little and done even less. What was I in her eyes? A little thing briefly there, and then gone in the vast workings of this world. In a very soft voice, as if she was imparting a great secret to me, she said, "I am a watcher, Zoe. I have been watching things for a long time. Now go to sleep." I could not argue with her command. It was given with such conviction, and I was too weak from the poison to argue. I was slipping into a deep, restful sleep that my body so craved, and I could no longer fight it just to ask questions. But I still remembered Eamund's words, "I love you. Come home. I shall. Oh, I shall." 21. Chapter 22. Yay, another chapter for you guys. This is based quite a bit from the book, and I know I promised Zoe would be back soon, but not till next chapter, which will be up soon. This is all Aragon, but next one will be with Zoe, and with quite a bit of Murtagh too. As always, a big, big thank you to everyone, and keep writing those reviews. Aragon woke with a groan, his body aching and his mind feeling fuzzy. Opening his eyes, Aragon saw the blue membrane of one of Saphira's wings like the roof of a tent. "Good afternoon, little one. Is it really that late?" "Yes. Brahm contacted me a little while ago and told me where you could go for bathe and change of clothes. Then he wants you to come and speak with Arya, and Ajahad. Ah, have you heard anything about Zoe? What of Murtagh? Apparently she is still asleep, but is in no danger. The healers were optimistic she would awake tomorrow. Murtagh has been shown to his own rooms and is still resting. Then we did succeed. I can't believe it. All that travel, and we've reached our destination. Yes, little one, we did." Saphira hummed happily, and the two sat in comfortable silence. They were both enjoying the chance at just sitting still and forgetting their worries for a time. After a few minutes of quiet reflection, Aragon pushed himself up and crawled out from under Saphira's wing. Stretching his stiff muscles, the rider examined his surroundings as he remembered the previous night. Auric had led him and Saphira down a long, smoothed wall tunnel for what had felt like a complete age. It had taken them nearly an hour to traverse the corridor. At last, they had come to two colossal black doors, accented by shimmering silver lines that depicted a seven-pointed crown that spanned both sides of the door. When Auric had pushed them open, Aragon and Saphira had found themselves inside a massive volcanic crater. Its walls narrowed to a small, ragged opening so high above that Aragon could not judge the distance. Through it, he had been able to see a few stars glimmering high above. The crater's far side, hazy blue in the distance, looked nearly 10 miles away. Giant icicles hundreds of feet thick and thousands of feet long hung leagues above them like glistening daggers. Dark mats of moss and lichen covered the walls. There had been a wide cobblestone path that had extended from the door's threshold. The path led straight to the center of the crater, where it ended at the base of a snowy white mountain that glittered like an uncut gem. The city was so brilliant that it lit up the ground around it. It was like a beacon for a ship coming in from the sea, the end of a long journey that had pushed Aragon and Saphira to their utmost limits. It was also the starting point of a new journey. Auric had led them quickly to the entrance of the city. Two massive gates were closed in front of them, but Auric had made no move to lead them inside. The dwarf had explained of the dragon hold that was at the top of the city mountain, and how to get there. By that point, Eragon was too tired to pay much attention and had nearly been unable to coordinate himself enough to mount Saphira. The flight up to the hold was a distant memory of flying, and he had just managed to slip off his dragon's back before falling into a deep sleep, his tired mind and body all too eager for the first true rest they had for weeks. Now, however, he was able to examine the cave with clear, rested eyes. The floor of the dragon hold was the great star sapphire, Isidar Mithram. The legendary star sapphire that was one of the dwarves' greatest treasures and a mark of their love for gems, as well as their craftsmanship. Beneath it was nothing but Tramheim's great central chamber. The round, rootless room that surrounded the gem was about 60 feet high and 60 feet across. The walls were lined with caves, and there were rungs so that people could reach the higher levels. An enormous archway led out of the dragon hold and towards a staircase that led downwards, not that Eragon could imagine many people using them if the hold was only used by dragons and their riders. The entire mountain was a monument to the single-minded determination of the dwarves, a feat that Eragon was sure could be managed by few other cities. Turning his attention to the inside of Saphira's cave, Eragon examined it. The cave was dark brown, and though it was roughly chiseled, it felt cozy, natural, and safe. Near the far wall was a thick cushion for Saphira to curl up on. Beside it was a bed built into the side of the wall, the bed that Eragon had not bothered with the previous night. The cave was lit by a single red lantern equipped with a shutter so its glow could be muted. Saphira touched his thoughts. "You should hurry, little one." Brahm sounded worried. "Will you fly me down?" Eragon did not relish walking all the way to the gates. His body was still sore from travel, and he still felt the lingering effects of exhaustion and stress. "Of course," was her quick and eager response. Making sure that his bow was fastened across his back and Zarok belted at his waist, Eragon swiftly mounted Saphira. He did not bother to fasten the straps around his legs, for the flight was short, and Eragon had grown accustomed to flying on Saphira. A mighty push, Saphira launched herself over top of the red jewel and into the air. The aerial view of City Mountain gave Eragon a unique view of the highly polished marble city with its elaborate carvings, golden griffins, pillars, sculptures, and the countless round windows that looked like the windows into another world. Sunlight filtered through the hole at the top of the mountain and made the white marble glow. Wondering what his dragon thought of the mountain city, Eragon asked her, "What do you think of it?" Saphira thought for a moment. "It is magnificent, I suppose, but I would prefer the open desert or even the spine. Dragons are not meant for cities." "No," agreed Eragon. Saphira descended quickly, and when they reached the ground, Auric was waiting for them. The stout dwarf was polishing his axe, but rose quickly when he saw them. It suddenly occurred to Eragon that he had yet to see many of the Varden or any more dwarves. That would most likely change soon. It was an intimidating thought. "Arget lamb," greeted the dwarf. Recognizing the elvish word for the riders, Eragon greeted the dwarf before saying, "Are you to assist me today?" The dwarf nodded and said, "Follow me, rider Eragon, Saphira." With one hand on Saphira's side, Eragon followed Auric through the main entrance to the city. A heavy gate rumbled open before them as hidden chains slowly raised it, revealing a 4-story high passageway that extended straight towards the center of Trondheim. The top 3 levels were pierced by rows of archways that revealed grey tunnels curving off into the distance. It was then that Eragon saw the people. They lined the streets, watching him and Saphira along with dwarves. The humans were hard, tough people whose eyes stared at him and Saphira with fierce curiosity. Children stayed close to their mothers, and none went without weapons. They were proud, but also weary. Reminded Eragon of people who were backed into a corner and would not hesitate to fight to the death to get out. Feeling self-conscious and embarrassed, Eragon said, "What should I do?" "Something. Wave or smile, but do something," snapped the dragon as she raised her massive head. Stealing his nerves, Eragon raised a hand and have a half-heeded wave, wishing all time that he had Brahm, Zoe, or Murtagh with him. Why had Brahm sent him into this so? No preparation or warning, just a simple command to meet Auric. The old storyteller had known this would happen, and yet he had not bothered to warn Eragon of it. From now on, Eragon would not follow his orders so blindly. At first nothing happened, but then someone cheered, and it spread like wildfire. Eragon breathed a sigh of relief as did Auric notice the rider. People began to roar, and while they gave Sapphira plenty of space, they followed close behind. Many pointed at Sapphira, whispering behind raised hands to each other. The dwarves, Eragon noticed, greatly outnumbered humans, and many of them walked away with stony faces. Old grudges reawakened at the sight of a rider and his dragon. These were the sort of challenges that he, as a rider, was going to face, uniting a people and forming new alliances with old enemies. It was a daunting prospect, especially if it was complicated by the other dwarves' clans who would be less than eager to accept him. At last they left the cheering crowd behind and found themselves in a wide, tall corridor where a few soldiers and dwarves hurried around them, barely glancing at Eragon or Sapphira. Auric led them until they reached a corridor with a wide balcony at the end that overlooked the lower levels of the city. It was quieter here, and the corridors were deserted. Auric turned and gave Eragon a gruff smile. "Sapphira, if you return to the dragon hold, you will find that fresh meat has been delivered. The tunnels I will take Eragon through are too small for you to fit comfortably." Broadcasting her thoughts, Sapphira said, "I will see you later. Yes, be careful. I fear that the dwarves are less than pleased to see us. No, we will have to be careful lest we give them more fuel for their fire. Watch yourself, little one. You have a terrible habit of getting into trouble when I'm not around." With that, she launched herself off the balcony and over the city mountain. Her scales sparkling like jewels in the sunlight, and she seemed even more magnificent than usual. Auric let out a long breath of air. "Ah, boy, you have been blessed indeed. That is gift that rivals the greatest of our treasures." Shaking his head, he then clapped his hands and said, "I neglect my duties. Come, let us find you some food." The dwarf turned away and began to walk towards one of the tunnels, but Eragon did not follow right away. He watched as the sapphire-blue dragon flew upwards, her scales catching the light. Auric was right. It was the greatest gift, but also one of the heaviest burdens. H had only to be reminded of the Empire's soldiers or the stony-faced dwarves to know that being a rider was not all glory or fame. Hurrying after the disappearing dwarf, Eragon followed the dwarf back into Trondheim and through a labyrinth of corridors until they came to a long room filled with rows of stone tables only high enough for dwarves. Fires blazed on soapstone ovens behind a long counter. The room was warm, and there was a friendly, relaxed atmosphere to this room that contrasted sharply with the opulence and regal, intimidating aspect of Trondheim. Auric spoke words in an unfamiliar language to one stout, ruddy-faced dwarf, who promptly handed them stone platters piled with steaming mushrooms and fish. Then Auric took Eragon up several flights of stairs and into a small alcove carved out of Trondheim's outer wall, where they sat cross-legged. Eragon promptly began to eat, wordlessly filling his grumbling stomach with the delicious food. After days of cold meals, you could have fed him nearly anything, and Eragon would have eaten it. When he had finished his meal, Eragon asked Auric, "I was told that Trondheim has a magnificent library. Do you think you could show it me one day?" Zoe had spoken of the library, and it had intrigued Eragon. A room filled with so many books it would take over a lifetime to read them all. It seemed rather inconceivable. Auric chuckled and drew a pipe from an inner pocket. "I would enjoy showing you it. Many of the books contained there cannot be found in the Empire because of Galbatorix. It is one of the marvels of Trondheim." Thinking of the man Brahm had killed the previous day, Eragon said, "What can you tell me of the twins?" Auric grumbled darkly. They came to Varden offering their magic skills. The Varden needed magicians, and so they were accepted. I suppose you wouldn't have heard, but only one of them was killed yesterday. The one that Brahm confronted, the other must have been warned by his brother and escaped using the tunnels beneath the mountain. Ajahad decided to risk losing men by following him. Eragon raised an eyebrow. He escaped. What would the implications of that be? A man eager for revenge and in contact with the Durza and Galbatorix was a dangerous enemy to anyone. "Aye," said Auric angrily. It was an embarrassment for all, and Arya was furious, as was Brahm and Ajahad. That was a sight I hope never to see again, an angry elf. Rising from his chair, the dwarf said, "Now come, you must want a change of clothes, and then you are expected by Ajahad. Best not to keep them waiting, they can tell you more." The two left behind the kitchen, and Auric led Eragon through more twisting, white marble passageways. A question occurred to Eragon. Auric. Yes. Have you lived here all your life? Why do you serve the Varden? Auric chuckled slightly. I am Hrothgar's nephew and his heir. My parents died of the pox and Hrothgar took me in. I serve the Varden because Hrothgar wished to strengthen connections between the dwarf clans and the Varden. I act both for mine king and Ajahad. Ah, said Eragon as he processed this information. It may be useful later on, especially when he met the powerful and crafty dwarven king. The tunnels became narrower and darker as they continued, slowly making their way down. Eragon reviewed what he did know of the city. It was mostly uninhabited, but Brahm had explained that it was meant to house the entire dwarves' nation in times of trouble, the fall of the riders being one such time. How many Varden are here? Less than 2,000. There are more in Surda under King Orin's protection. Don't worry, boy. When the time comes to fight, there are more than enough capable dwarves already here. Anyone who can fight will. The elves have also promised their support when the time to challenge the Empire comes. Eragon filed away that bit of information. It did not reduce the worry that had formed within him after seeing the small number of Varden. After seeing the might of the Empire's army, it would take more than 2,000 to win the coming battles, no matter how strong he or Saphira became. The elves, if what he had seen of Arya's skill was common among all elves, would be worthy allies, but again, the Varden was too small to pose any kind of serious threat to the might of the Empire. The tunnels became increasingly smaller, until Eragon was forced to stoop to avoid the ceiling. All the lanterns that lit the tunnel were red. So the light doesn't blind you when you leave or enter a dark cavern, explained Auric when Eragon asked. It intrigued Eragon to see the way the dwarves had built the city and their obvious fondness for the dark, twisting tunnels. At last they entered a bare room with a small door on the far side. Auric pointed. The pools are through there, along with brushes and soap. Leave you clothes here, and I will have new ones waiting for you. Eragon thanked him, and the dwarf left. Quickly undressing, Eragon opened the door and stepped into a pitch-black room. He inched forward until his foot touched warm water, and then eased himself into the pool. Eragon wasted no time, and after ensuring that all the blood, sweat, and grime was washed away, he left the pools and made his way back to the lighted room. A clean set of clothes was waiting for him. They were made of soft but durable cloth and fitted him well. Anything was better than the clothes he had been wearing, but still, these were finer than anything he had worn before. When he had dressed, Eragon left the room and found Auric, smoking his pipe, waiting for him. The dwarf led him back through the levels until they reached the long, white marble corridor where they had left Saphira. Auric gestured towards the balcony. Ask Saphira to meet us here, and then I will take you to Ajahad's study. Nodding, Eragon reached for Saphira. She was happily licking her claws clean after polishing off a large hunk of meat. Saphira, yes, little one. Will you meet Auric and me at the same place? It is time to meet Ajahad. I will be there soon. Sure enough, the dragon landed less than 2 minutes later. Auric greeted her and then hurriedly led them through more corridors until they reached a circular room, perhaps 1,000 feet across, that reached put to the top of the city mountain. The walls were lined with arches, and the floor was made of polished carnelian, upon which was etched a hammer girdled by 12 silver pentacles. The mark, Eragon remembered, of King Hrothgar's clan, the same clan that it seemed Auric belonged to. For his dwarven guide's helmet was emblazoned with the same hammer and pentacles. The room was a nexus for 4 hallways, including the one they had just exited that divided Trondheim into quarters. Auric did not pause, just lead them to one of the corridors. They followed it for several hundred feet, and then entered a small corridor. After a few sharp turns, they came to a massive cedar door, stained black with age. 2 guards were stationed on either side, but they did not register their arrival, but rather remained as immobile as statues. Saphira blew gently on Eragon. Be ready, little one. We are about to enter the game of politics, and it is just as dangerous as any battle. Keep your thoughts and opinions to yourself. Claws and swords of no more use here. Yes, making sure his mental shields were securely in place, Eragon watched as Auric knocked 3 times on the wood door. The door swung open, and Auric gestured them inside. Steeling himself, Eragon followed the dwarf inside with Saphira close behind. The study was high-ceilinged and circular in shape. Tall bookshelves lined the walls, and floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the city below. A large desk, stacked high with papers, faced the door. The chair behind it was occupied by Ajahad. Two of the three chairs in front of the desk were occupied with Arya on the far right and Brahm on the far left. Auric bowed to the three before exiting, closing the door behind him. Rising from his chair, Brahm gave Iragan a small smile. He looked terrible, his hair still matted with blood, and the dark circles under his eyes no less pronounced. Iragan wondered if he had slept at all. Iragan, Saphira, there was a note of relief in his voice. We've been waiting for you. Good afternoon, Rider Iragan, Saphira. I hope you had enough rest. Ajahad's voice was rich, and his eyes never strayed from Iragan's face. Remembering the etiquette that Brahm had drilled him in, Iragan bowed his head and said smoothly, We did, thank you. Sit, Iragan, said Arya. It may have been Iragan's imagination, but he thought the elf looked tense and unsettled. Her hands seemed to be gripping the arm rests of her chair unnaturally tight, and her forest green eyes never left his face. Wondering what was going on, Iragan took the offered chair, and Saphira settled behind him. His face carefully empty of thought or emotion, the young rider waited and watched. He would not make the first move. No, he would let someone else do it. 22. Many meetings. Murtagh groaned as he pushed himself upright. He was sitting in a comfortable bed in a darkened room, the same room that Arya had brought him to early that morning. The elf had woken him from his slumber in the chair and brought him to her own suite of rooms. Murtagh doubted the elf princess had slept more than a few hours, but he was too tired to ask. The only clear thing he remembered was Arya making him promise to stay in the rooms until she returned with Brahm. He knew why. A son of Morzan would not be welcomed anywhere, no matter how much he proved his good intentions. Better to stay locked in his rooms than venture out where others would see him, and knowing his luck, want to kill him. Shaking his head to try and clear his dark thoughts, Murtagh examined the room with methodical care. It was high-ceilinged, and the heavy dark green curtains were drawn across the windows that must overlook the city. Tall bookcases lined the walls, and there was an oval table in one corner around which 4 chairs were arranged. An open door showed the sitting room, and another door to the left of the bed must lead into a bathroom. From what he could see from his place on the bed, there were no obvious spy holes, but he would have to do a more thorough examination once his head was clearer. On a small nightstand beside the large, 4-poster bed was a stack of clothes. Murtagh frowned in puzzlement as he rose and picked the clothes up. They were of simple design, but the fabric was of good quality. The kind of clothes the ones he was wearing had once been before the endless travel and fighting. They were not as fine as some of the clothing items he had worn in the Empire, but he preferred these. Finery would always remind him of Galbatorix and his father, both things he would rather forget permanently. Leaving the bed, Murtagh made his way to the bathroom. He was looking forward to washing away the grime and blood. Hopefully Arya or Brahm would be back soon, and then he might be able to visit Zoe. He had heard nothing about her, and he had forgotten to ask Arya, his mind too befuddled to think of more than a comfortable bed. He wondered what was going to happen to him. He was surrounded by his father's enemies, who were in turn his enemies. The odds were not in his favor, but then when had they ever been in his favor? It was a grim thought, but it was the brutal truth, and he would not run from the truth. We have been discussing the threat posed by the Urgles, said Brahm. The old storyteller was watching Iragan's face closely. So far the rider was maintaining an impressive poker face, and it was nearly impossible to read a dragon when they did not want you to. Along with that threat is the one now posed by the escaped twin. The rider shook his head. Auric mentioned it briefly, but did not go into details. Ajahad steepled his hands, and his eyes focused on a bookcase. The faint frown lines around his mouth deepened as he concentrated fiercely on the problem at hand. The twin that Brahm dueled was able to warn his brother of the attack, and that warning gave him enough of a lead to escape our clutches. He has vanished into the tunnels, and is no doubt on his way to either the Urgles or Durza, desperate for revenge. This leads us to the matter of the Urgles. We know they are planning on attacking the Varden, and in turn the dwarves, but not when or what their exact numbers are. Arya has suggested that you and Saphira leave as soon as possible for Duweldenvarden so that you can begin your training there and are kept out of the battle that will be on its way. Iragan was silent, but to Saphira he said, I am not sure I want to be safely away while others risk their lives, but Arya does have a point. I am not ready to face Durza. Maybe not, but let us hear more before we make any final decision. Turning his full attention back to the man in front of him, Iragan noticed the tension that Ajahad was holding his shoulders. Arya's suggestion was not going over well with the leader of the Varden, and it had obviously caught Brahm in the middle. Was this another attempt by the elf to secure him and Saphira's loyalty for just the elves? Was it this matter that had the man before the rider so worried? Iragan knew that the Varden's leader would want as much control over him and Saphira as possible, and protect this loyalty from the elven queen as much as possible. Ajahad, to Iragan's surprise, took the blunt, straight-to-the-truth approach with his next words. I, however, believe that it would be in both you and Saphira's best interests to remain here. Not only would it increase your standing with the Varden and dwarves, but it would increase morale among the men. Imagine what it would feel like to them if they saw you fleeing from battle. The Varden admire you, but to us deeds speak more than words or legends long forgotten. We will also need all the help you can offer, for I fear we will be sorely outmatched in this battle. Iragan was unsure how to reply, but he was saved from doing so when Brahm spoke. His voice was tense, and Iragan was surprised, but how little control the old man was using. He must, realized the rider as he glanced quickly at his father's lined face, be both weary and frustrated by this development. It is your choice, Iragan, but if you choose to leave with Arya, then you must leave either tonight or early tomorrow. What do you think, Saphira? We may alienate Arya if we choose to remain, but we risk the same with the Varden, and they are the people we are meant to defend against the Empire. It is losing situation all round, little one. Yet I think we should remain. It does not sit well with me, this leaving. As we saw today, the Varden are not as strong as they would have us believe. The dwarves may be, but they are fickle in their loyalties. I think it is time we demonstrated a little of our independence. Besides, if we did choose to leave, we would be leaving Zoe and Murtagh to face this upcoming battle alone. You are right. If to earn the Varden's respect, I must endanger my friendship with the elves, then I must choose the lesser of the two evils. I will stay and see this battle through, and I will stay by your side. Carefully choosing his words, Iragan said quietly, Saphira and I wish to remain and assist the Varden however we can. But here, Iragan paused to give his words more impact. We will leave afterwards in search of the elves. I need the training that only they can offer me, and the sooner I receive it the better for all parties involved. Arya leaned forward, her eyebrows drawn together in a formidable frown. I will not argue with you, Iragan, but I want an oath from you that you will leave this place as soon as you and Saphira are able to. You must go to my people as soon as possible, and I want nothing coming between that. A great deal rests on your continued training. Saphira decided to answer this. Her great rumbling voice made even Ajahad wince slightly. Do not demand such things from us, Arya. We well know the things that rest on our shoulders, and they are heavy burdens without you adding oaths to those. Iragan and I will go as soon as we are able, but not a moment sooner. Arya met Saphira's bright eyes. Very well, Saphira, but I think only for you and Iragan's sake. That may be, but you should not doubt us so, and neither should you. Here she turned her full attention to Ajahad, who looked slightly surprised and overwhelmed by the force of the dragon's mind. I dislike being treated like a chess piece, and if you continue to do so, then I will destroy the board on which you play. Silence fell. It was a silence that Iragan felt no need to break, even as it stretched out longer and longer. Inside, the rider was both shocked by Saphira's harsh words and also glad that she had so thoroughly stated her and Iragan's feelings. Only Saphira could afford such a bold move, for she was the last female dragon in existence, and none could risk affronting her. Finally, Brahm, in a much more relaxed tone, said diplomatically, "On to other topics of discussion. Have the Varden begun to evacuate those who cannot fight to Serda, and have messengers been sent to the elves?" Iragan relaxed back into his chair as he listened to Ajahad and Brahm discuss when the women and children should leave, where scouts should be posted, and how to deal with any opposition from the dwarven clans. Finally, Brahm said, "I believe that all that needs to be spoken of has, except for one thing, Murtagh." Iragan tensed slightly. What would Ajahad do? Would he mistrust Murtagh because of his parentage, or would he be able to accept Iragan's half-brother? Loyalty to Murtagh may pull Eragon and Saphira in another direction when they were already feeling stretched. Ajahad ran a hand through his hair before saying, I will send someone for him. He should be here before anything is decided. I cannot, for his own safety, allow him to wander around Trondheim. The dwarves would kill him on sight if they found out he was Morzen's son. Yet I think that is a matter that should wait for morning. My thoughts are elsewhere tonight, Brahm. Brahm nodded, and then looked at Eragon. Would you and Saphira like to return to the dragon hold? Eragon suddenly realized that he still felt the lingering effects of exhaustion, and sensing that Brahm would rather he was not here when Murtagh's fate was decided, rose from his chair. I will return with Saphira. Arya rose as well. I will accompany you to the main hall. Eragon inwardly groaned. He was certain that Arya would speak to him of his refusal to leave the Varden until after the Urgles attacked, and he was not sure he wished to speak of that matter with her. As he turned to leave, Ajahad suddenly spoke up from behind him, and the words made Eragon turn slightly to meet the intense gaze of the man seated behind the giant table. Rider Eragon, I have a word of caution for you. The Varden are stirred by your arrival and what it means for our future. Many will seek out you and Saphira's assistance in solving their problems, and I wish you to know that I expect all my people to be treated with the utmost respect and fairness, no matter how petty their worries are. The man's gaze was fierce, and Eragon felt a little more weight settle on his shoulders as he met the Varden leader's eyes. His voice heavy, Eragon said, I understand. Ajahad's gaze softened a little. I hope you do, Rider. Nodding farewell to his father, Eragon, with Arya beside him and Saphira behind him, left the study. The moment they were out of hearing distance of the silent guards that stood watch over Ajahad's study, Arya turned on him, and Eragon had to summon all his inner fortitude not to cower before the force of that gaze. What are you thinking, Eragon? Her voice, while demanding, was not harsh. Her gaze was not angry, rather worried, and it was worry directed at him and Saphira. It was worry raised by the prospect of battle, and realized Eragon, the very real prospect of confronting Durza. I can understand why you felt that you had to remain here to help the Varden, but you need to continue your training. Eragon sighed and walked to one of the many open windows that lined the corridor. It offered a spectacular view of the shining city. During his time in the study, the sun had slipped away, and the city was now lit by thousands of lights, which made the marble gleam and the golden accents glow with rich warmth in a quiet voice. His gaze never leaving the fairy tale sight before him, Eragon did his best to explain. People seem to think that I am not aware of the politics around me, Arya, but I am very aware. I know the debt I owe the elves for Saphira, and I know that I must ally myself with the Varden because I need their help. However, I have no intention of allowing myself to be caught in a net where I owe too many people too many things, nor am I ignorant of my responsibilities as a rider. I know what Saphira and I represent to the Varden, and that is a burden I am still unfamiliar with. Arya rested a hand gently on his shoulder. I have misjudged you, Eragon. How have you done that? Asked Eragon with a raised eyebrow as he glanced back at her. I am a farm boy trying to be a rider, and I am failing at that. He heard Saphira give a low growl at his words, but Eragon was focused on the elf in front of him. For Saphira would only tell him he was being foolish, but Arya would tell him the truth. She was not the kind of person who sugar-coated the truth, nor was she in a position which afforded her such luxuries. No, said Arya with a firm shake of her head. You are not a farm boy any longer, Eragon. Yes, you are young and inexperienced, but not in the way I feared. Already you are a powerful player, and as you demonstrated in your meeting with Ajahad, you are more than capable of weighing dangerous odds. She smiled slightly as if amused by her own words. I was wrong, and I allowed my own fears and feelings to cloud what was truly in front of me. I ask for you and Saphira's forgiveness for making a difficult situation worse. For a second, Eragon did not know what to say, but when he did find his voice, he merely said, You honor me with your words, Arya Svitkona. Behind him, Saphira inclined her great head in acceptance to the elf and her words. Remembering Brahm's lessons, Eragon twisted his hand over his chest in the elvish sign of respect and said, I never thanked you for Saphira, but I think that I owe that to you now. Arya nodded her head. You are welcome, Eragon. You have already repaid your debt to me by showing that you are worthy of the honor. Do you wish me to show you the way to the central chamber?" Eragon paused and looked at Saphira. "That may be a good idea. I fear that I am as lost in Trondheim as if it was a maze with no end." Arya smiled a little wider and said, "Then follow me." With that, she led the two through the corridors and back into the large, circular chamber where the star rose glittered far above. A small group of people made room for the large sapphire dragon, watching her with wide and amazed eyes. "Arya." "Yes, Eragon. Would you pass my greetings on to Murtagh for me if you see him?" The elf nodded and then said, "You should go now, Eragon, before more people come to admire the new rider and dragon. I will see you tomorrow." Eragon nodded and quickly mounted Saphira, who launched herself upwards into the still air with a powerful push. The two glided above the white city for a little while. Simply enjoying the other's companionship before Eragon said, "Was your words to Ajahad a wise choice, Saphira?" She snorted, "I am a dragon and I wanted him to realize that. I am not some sort of horse or cannon, but a dragon. I know, but what is done, little one. That study made my scales itch, and it was unfair of Arya and Ajahad to put us in such a position, but I can see why they did it. Yes, I suppose." Eragon rested his cheek against the warm scales of Saphira's neck and found himself drifting towards sleep. He woke briefly when Saphira landed and slipped under her wing, but then he fell deeply asleep. I was waking. I felt as if I was coming up for air after diving deep into a still, deep pool. The path to waking was a long one, it seemed, but I was glad to be waking. I had been sleeping for far too long, and I wanted to be part of the waking, moving world again. My thoughts, sluggish at first, slowly started to clear, and I felt life return to my body. After so long of being cut off, adrift in darkness, the feel was a strange one, for I suddenly felt heavy once more as gravity took control. I forced my eyes open to see the white ceiling of the room that I woken in before. The bed was soft beneath me, and the blankets over top of me were warm and soft. My mouth was dry, but I no longer felt like I had just been frozen, microwaved, and then frozen again. What a relief. A voice came from my left, and a face appeared over top of me. It was a very beautiful face, an elven face, for only an elf could have a face that was as perfect, as flawless as this. Not a single imperfection or blemish upon it. A white, unmarked canvas upon which no age showed nor any sign of past experiences. So this must be Arya. She seemed to glow from within, and while her face was angular, it was refined with high cheekbones and brilliant emerald green eyes. Having that perfect face gazing down at me, when I knew I did not look my best, made me feel about as attractive as a fly next her butterfly. Arya seemed to be quite the all-star. Flawless beauty, powerful magic abilities, unrivaled swordsmanship, superb diplomatic skills. And as if this was not enough, the elf was a warrior princess. Yet there was much under this mask of perfection, and I could not help but feel that Arya and I would either be the greatest of friends or the worst enemies. I had imagined a friendship between us because we were very similar in many respects, but I was an unknown quantity, a dangerous unknown quantity, and sometimes too much similarity can be the force that drives people apart. I felt no envy for her. How could one envy someone such as this? "You're awake, at last." Arya's voice was smooth like a quick-flowing mountain stream, and it contained all the chill of winter breeze. Not exactly a warm welcome back to land of the living. I couldn't help but feel a little insulted with her at last comment. What did she think I had been doing? Catching up on my beauty rest. My irritation was unreasonable, however, and so I forced it away. When dealing with elves' emotions and hasty words could be fatal, and this would be first test against one of the fair folk race. I pushed myself up slowly. I felt stiff, but otherwise my head was clear and nothing hurt at all. I did not even ache like I had before. Making sure my voice was friendly, I said, "Nice to meet you two." Finally able to observe the room around me, I took in the sight of it. It was long and obviously was some sort of healing hall. Beds and cupboards lined the walls, and the curtain at the end of the room showed a little of some sort of balcony. Place was deserted, and I wondered why. Surely it would be bustling with at least a few healers or a few other injured people. Had I been placed in an unused ward because of who I arrived with? Arya narrowed her eyes slightly at me. "Who are you, Zoe?" right to the point, and straight off the bat to Arya, without even giving me a few minutes to collect myself. Nice job. Learned some interrogation tactics from Durza, maybe. I groaned inwardly, and once again had to rein in my irritation and impatience. I am me, I paused, watching irritation flicker across Arya's face. Before she could snap my head off again, I said, I would rather go into this with you at another time, when I know a little of what is going on. I need to know now. I winced at the sharpness in the elf's voice, and a little flame of anger mixed with righteous indignation began to grow inside of me. I, as I had just discovered, was every bit as regally whatever as this elf princess, and it was because of me, yes me, that she was not the one lying in this bed, or, even worse, on her way to Galbatrois. Call me immature, but I triple dare you not feel insulted by this elf when you have just woken up from 2 weeks of being stuck in a trance slowly dying of poison. I allowed a little of my own feelings to slip into my voice now. Though it was not as sharp as Arya's, it was enough to let her know that she had crossed a line with me then. Why? Why do you suddenly demand answers from me, especially right now? I met the elf's gaze with my own as we silently challenged the other to a staring contest that lasted for a whole minute before Arya said, her voice low and commanding. During the time I traveled with Brahm, Iragan, Murtagh, and Saphira, they told me little of you or your past. You know the inner and most secret workings of the Empire. You somehow have become so important to your companions that they risk death by exhaustion or urgles to reach the Varden in time to save you. Was it for friendship? Or was it because you are too important to die? Do you understand now why I question you so closely? Listen to me closely, Arya Svitkona. I paused for a moment and then continued in a heated whisper. If my friends told you nothing of my past, it is to protect this world. It is because of me that you sit here and are able to ask me these questions, and if my friends chose to risk their lives for my sake, then it is because they are my friends, and they know I would do the same for them. I owe you some answers, and I know that, especially after the way I contacted you in Gilead, but this is neither the place nor time for them. Once again, we stared each other down, and I wondered just how much longer I was going to have to fight this. Already, within a few minutes of regaining consciousness, I was embroiled in another fight. Is this all my life has become? The elf sighed and shook her head. I expected more demands and more of her sharp anger, but her next words surprised me. Fine, Zoe, but I expect answers and I want them soon. I inclined my head. You will have them. She would too. I knew all too well what it felt like to be purposely kept in the dark when you knew that you deserved answers. The elf nodded her head and then said, I am sorry if I began our relationship with harsh words, but you've been a very complex question that has plagued my thoughts since I first talked to you. I am not used to such problems, and I hope to answer all my questions the moment you were awake and we were alone. I smirked slightly and refrained from saying what I really felt about her harsh words. I understand, Arya, what has been happening. The elf sighed and began to summarize all the key events of the past 2 weeks I had been knocked out. I listened with growing horror and anger as she explained of Brahm's killing of the one of the twins and the other's escape into the tunnels. That silly, stupid, revenge-seeking storyteller. Why did he have to leap in the moment he met the twin and kill him? Yes, it was my fault for telling him of the two magicians' betrayal, but still, I had awoken to a complete and utter mess. A mess that was about to get more complicated, for the Varden would expect me to tell them exactly how and when the Urgles would attack. Something that was too risky for me to do without risking the future. The twins could die after the Varden won, after this key victory was secured, but it seemed my life was just going to get a little more complicated. It would all turn out all right. Hopefully. Maybe. Got any spare luck you could lend me? When Arya finished, I said, Sounds like it has been quite the time. Is there any way I can escape this place? I need to see Brahm. And give that storyteller another lecture on waiting before killing, or at least waiting to speak to me before he did. The elf nodded and said, Your clothes have been cleaned and repaired. Your weapons are with them, and your other belongings are in my apartments. Once you are dressed, I will take you to see Brahm. I know that Ajahad is eager to meet you, and your companions will be relieved to see you among the waking again. With that, Arya rose and left, closing the door softly behind her. Once she was gone, I pushed the covers off and tested my legs, which felt strong enough. perhaps a little weak from my endless sleep and the poison, but otherwise I felt all right. There was a bowl of clean water and a rag beside my bed, which I used to quickly wipe my face and arms. Someone had already washed my hair, and I was reasonably clean, but the water was refreshing. My clothes and weapons were neatly placed at the end of my bed on a folding stool, and as there was no one around, I quickly changed and left the simple white shift I had been wearing on the bed. Once my sword was firmly belted around my much thinner waist and my bow secure, I left the healing hall. Arya was waiting for me outside, and without a word she set off through the white marble corridors of Trondheim, with me trailing a few steps behind her. On our walk through the corridors, we passed by many dwarves and the occasional human. Whenever we did meet someone, they paused and stared at both Arya and I tried to ignore them and focus on the back of my elf guide. But it was not easy when I heard whispering and the occasional word of "that's the girl," or "they say she is a friend of the rider." I wondered how I had coped with this in my other world, my other life where I had been the center of attention. The newfound knowledge of who I really was hadn't really set in, and I was doing my best to ignore it. I want to just live in the moment and not wonder what kind of memories and feelings would be popping over the horizon in the next few weeks. How would I change? How had this already changed me? I didn't feel any different, but I did feel a little more secure in myself. The constant worry of what vision might flicker in front of my eyes and just who I was had been wearing down on me. Now, well, now I knew. I knew enough to start rebuilding the foundation of who I was, slowly but surely, brick by brick. I was so wrapped up in my thoughts that I really didn't admire the city like I may have had my thoughts no been so demanding. As it was, I nearly walked into Arya when she stopped outside a black cedar door that was guarded by two stone-faced, stuck-up-looking guards who did not shift from their place when Arya pushed open the door, and I followed her inside. I was reminded of the guards at Buckingham Palace. They might as well have been made of stone, and I had to bite my lower lip to keep in an immature giggle. The study reminded me vaguely of the one I had met Eamund in. However, this one overlooked the glistening white marble city of Trondheim, and it was much bigger. The ceiling was vaulted, and it could easily fit Saphira without her having to worry about banging into the bookcases or hitting the ceiling. Sitting at the heavy, dark wood desk was Ajahad, the leader of the Varden. He was an impressive, dark-skinned man that was watching me with the look of one who has just seen an interesting new player enter the game and is excited to see how they can be maneuvered. It made me feel uncomfortable, and I wondered if I was ready for this. Also sitting there was Brahm, and beside him was Murtagh, who the moment he saw me, leapt up and said happily, "Zoe." His dark eyes shone with relief, and I saw his shoulders relax slightly as if a weight had been taken from them. I smiled openly as joy rose up within me at the sight of two companions. "Murtagh, how good it is to see you again, and you to Brahm." Murtagh stepped forward and hugged me tightly. He was wearing new clothes that fitted him well, but I noticed the dark shadows under his eyes. The wild ride to save my life had left its marks upon even the young, strong warrior before me. When he pulled back from the embrace, I said quietly, "I hope that all is well with you, Murtagh." He nodded, and I felt a little better. At least Murtagh was not currently locked up with an uncertain future at the hands of the Varden, at least for now. Brahm rose then and said, "You gave us quite the scare, girl." He too embraced me, and the familiar smell of pipe smoke that hung around him made me smile. Brahm looked exhausted, and I felt guilt rise inside of me. They had done that desperate ride, all for my sake. Few could claim such friends, and I was one of those very lucky few. "I am sorry, Brahm." He sighed nosily and said with a smile, "Ah, well, girl, at least you are still standing in front of us." He stepped back and gestured towards Ajahad, who rose from his chair. "May I introduce you to Ajahad, leader of the Varden?" Somewhere another part of me flickered on, and a ready, smooth answer came from me. I smiled slightly as if I was honored to meet the man, and I met the fierce, dark gaze of the man at the desk with my own gaze. I secretly challenged him to try and test his limits with me, for I sensed that it was better to get this part of my relationship with the Varden over and done with right now. "Well met, Ajahad of the Varden." I felt as if I had done this 1,000 times, and I saw a flicker of surprise in Brahm's eyes, but my focus was on the man in front of me who looked at me with new and keen interest. Let him try, I thought. I am not a pawn. Let him test himself against me. Who was this? Who was this person speaking? Was this me? Well met indeed, my lady. News of your deeds has reached my ears, and the Varden owes you much for your assistance. His lips curved upwards slightly in a subtle sort of hint of a smile that conveyed a certain amount of enjoyment in this game of words. I smiled slightly in response and said calmly, if my reputation precedes me first, then yours most certainly does. I kept my face clear of emotion, and my full attention was on Ajahad. I felt strange, as if a new kind of intoxicating power was sweeping through my veins and filling me with cool confidence. Indeed, said Ajahad, whipping right back with his own answer. From what Brahm tells me, you have a great deal of knowledge of the Empire. So Brahm had spoken of that, had he? Or had Ajahad merely put two and two together? A combination of things, most likely. Knowledge, I batted back quickly. That is gained from observing the movement of Galbatoir's troops and his own motives. Before our battle of words could continue, Brahm interrupted. Zoe, would you like a seat? What of you, Arya? I sensed that Brahm was desperate to try and stop this battle before Ajahad backed me into a corner, but I wanted to take a risk. I accepted the offered chair, as did Arya, but the second we were seated in front of the large wooden desk, Ajahad suddenly changed tactics to that of a host welcoming a guest who he had been concerned about. I hope you are fully recovered from the poison. I leaned back. After all, you might as well be comfortable when dueling with words, and said with a smile, I am, thank you. It is a wonder you were able to survive as long as you did. I shrugged and said, I was very lucky. I kept my answers short, one-sided, and forced Ajahad to make all the moves, which he did. Your accent is one that I am not familiar with. Neither is yours. I saw a flash of irritation in Ajahad's eyes, but it faded quickly to be replaced by a calculating one. Once again he changed tactics, as if he hoped that a new approach would yield better results. Why do you so openly oppose Galbatorix? I am supposed to be dead. Anyone would risk death when they are supposed to be dead. Your answers are crooked, my lady. I give them when the questions themselves are straight. I watched him closely. Inside, I was amused, but I was also wondering what the consequences of this dance of words would be. Ajahad shook his head. I wonder what your arrival means for the Varden. It depends on how the Varden wishes to see it. Ajahad tilted his head and gazed at me thoughtfully before saying quietly, Who are you? I sighed and shook my head slightly. Why does everyone ask that? I am nothing here, and nor do I wish to be anything particularly important. It could be argued that all that has happened is because of your meddling. Brahm and Arya were left behind in this conversation. This was between me and the leader of the Varden. I shrugged. Perhaps, but it can also be argued that we are little more than pieces of game that is played by fate and fortune. What will you do now? Whatever is required of me to ensure the safety of those I care for. I met Ajahad's gaze with my own, steely one, and I hoped he realized the true meaning of my words. They meant I would not ally myself with the Varden, but rather continue to serve only myself and my friends. In other words, I was still a free agent, but I could be influenced if my friends were the glint of understanding in Ajahad's eyes. I saw that he fully understood my words. Brahm broke the silence with a sharp voice. What was the purpose of that? I glanced at him. His eyes were irritated, and from the set of his mouth I could guess that he had found the entire conversation to be grating and far too intense for his liking. Arya looked a little bored, and as if she had expected nothing less but nothing more. Murtagh just looked on impassive, his eyes fixed on me, and Ajahad as if he was waiting for a sword fight. Ajahad smiled a little. The purpose of that was to find out just what opponent we each face. I have found one that is quick on her feet and a dangerous ally. I smiled slightly and said soothingly, Is there something specific you wish to discuss, Brahm? No, snapped the storyteller. Murtagh, run along. Iragan will meet you at the front gates to spar in an hour. Auric will show you the way. Murtagh nodded, and farewells were said. I suddenly wished I could go with him and spar. It would be a wonderful way to find out if my strength had returned in full, but my audience with Ajahad was not over. Now, Zoe, said Ajahad, with greetings over and pleasantries exchanged, there is the matter of the Urgles. Is there anything you can tell us that may be of use? I watched the man in front of me carefully. His eyes were worried, and I saw tension in the clench of his jaw. Yet, despite that, I wondered what I should say. When I spoke, it was with the utmost care. The only thing that will be of use to you, and I suspect you have already guessed this, is that Durza will be a part of this battle. Ajahad leaned forward. His voice became sharper. If you are hiding things that may save my people, then I want to know them now, or their deaths will be on your consciousness. I leaned forward too, and my voice became harder, lower, and sharper. I grow tired of this conversation, but I will repeat this time to you. I do not hide information that will save lives, but I will not reveal knowledge that will kill those same lives, maybe not today or tomorrow, but later, when the stakes are higher and more depends on winning. You will have to trust my judgment if you want my information or assistance. If that price is too high for you, Ajahad of the Varden, then say so now, and I will not waste my time on such matters. Silence fell, deep, heavy silence, and I waited it out, knowing that it was necessary that all three people in this room heard those words. Brahm already did, but Arya and Ajahad. No, they needed to understand this part of me and what it meant to ask me for information. It was not free, nothing ever was, but was I worth that price? That was their decision to make. At long last, Ajahad spoke. We need you. The Varden need you, and if that is the price we must pay, then so be it. I only hope that you are wise enough to know when this knowledge is needed. I inclined my head. It is no easy burden, but I promise you that, in time, all will be revealed to you. Ajahad nodded slowly, and I rose from my chair. I felt the urge to run or to walk, or to vent some of the pent-up energy inside of me. I wish to see Aragon. Brahm and Arya nodded understanding, but before I could leave, Ajahad spoke again. You gave no answer when I asked you who you were, Zoe. So I ask again, who are you? My hand tightened around the hilt of my sword, but when I answered, my voice was calm, collected, and even. I am many things, my lord, but above all I am a friend. I am friend to Aragon, to Saphira, to Brahm, to Murtagh, and perhaps to the Varden. As a friend, I will fight for those I care for, even if the price is my life. Ajahad said nothing, just inclined his head, and I turned, making my way to the door and back out into the hallway. A moment later, Brahm appeared behind me, and then Arya. We walked in silence back to main chamber with its 4 tunnels. No one was there, and everything was silent. Brahm gazed at me and said, You continue to amaze me, girl. Why did you do what you did? Because, Brahm, I cannot afford to simply hand out such information freely. You cannot expect me to, and I had hoped you understood that. I do, he said seriously, but the worry was still there and the fear. But I have never seen you go on the attack so, Zoe. Why did you engage with Ajahad so? You have only made yourself more interesting to the Varden by displaying a complete lack of respect for Ajahad's position or his requests. I sighed and suddenly became aware of my grumbling stomach. Food would be welcome after this conversation, but first I had to finish this. I went on the attack with Ajahad because he believed me an easy-to-use pawn from your description. I would rather he treat me like a wild card, an independent player, and realized that my knowledge does not come free now than in the middle of a battle. Brahm shook his head and said, I will see you later, Arya. With that, the storyteller turned and left through one of the tunnels, leaving me with the silent elf. I looked at Arya and said, What should I do now? Come back with me to my apartments. We can speak, and there will be food waiting there too. I smiled slightly, and Arya and I left the hall. I hoped to be able to return and meet Murtagh and Aragon at the training field for a spar. That would be fun, and it would be a good excuse to use my sword. The elf had spacious rooms in a long hallway of more white marble with the occasional richly embroidered tapestry on the wall. Inside the apartments were 3 bedrooms, each with a view of the city, and a well-furnished sitting room that could also be used as a sort of dining room. Someone had left a tray of oatmeal, bread, a selection of jams, and a pot of hot tea along with some cups and milk on a table. The meal was light, but filling to my shrunken stomach. Arya waited until I had finished my first meal in ages before asking, Will you tell me now? I leaned back with a cup of tea and considered the best way to approach the situation. You know, I do know come from Alagaesia, but what you do not know is that I come from another world. Another world? Asked Arya, confused and shocked by my words. Remembering the way Eamund had explained it, I did my best. Yes, another world, a completely different universe. These worlds are separated by a kind of of curtain that both divides and links them. However, some things can slip though the curtain, like ideas or stories. There are also gateways, portals that allow for travel between these worlds, though they are difficult to use and even harder to find. So you found one of these gateways. And so I explained. It felt good to talk about it all, and Arya was a patient listener. I told her of waking up in the middle of Brahm and Iragan's campsite, of the strange visions that turned out to be my resurfacing memories, of Eamund and the truth about my heritage. When I finished, Arya was silent, but her face was calm, her eyes soft, not hard or suspicious. When she spoke, her voice was low. Your tale is a wondrous one, and I now understand why you do not speak of it lightly, Zoe, daughter of Angard and Le. The burden of the future and the past hang around you, but I am honored to know you. I felt a great sense of relief, of relaxation spread through me. She believed me. Somehow having Arya accept all that I had told her made everything seem more easy to understand and put it in perspective. Thank you, Arya Svitkona. I had never meant to thank you more than I did right then. Arya smiled, and then she rose, offering a hand, and I accepted it, rising so we were eye to eye. Let us go, Spa. I wish to see you in action with your sword, and I promised Ajahad I would watch Iragan to determine his level of skill. I would love to use my sword again, I said with a smile. With that, my new friend, how remarkable considering our first interaction with each other, and I made our way through a series of shortcuts, of hidden doorways and city streets to the front gates and the sparring fields. My heart was a little lighter with the knowledge that I could count Arya as a friend, but it was counteracted by the heavy with the knowledge of what was to come. This peace would not last long. No, soon it would be shattered with the bellows of Urgles, the screams of dying men, and stained red with blood. Shattered. Broken. What was I doing? Revised 1/17/2014. 23. Duels and complicated feelings. The unruly clatter of fighting reached Iragan and Murtag's ears as they came to the training field. The loud clang of steel clashing on steel, the solid thump of arrows striking padded targets, the rattle and crack of wooden staves, and the shouts of men in mock battle. The noise was confusing, yet each group had a unique rhythm and pattern. The sight was intimidating to a person used to dueling in the relative quiet of a small camp. Suddenly, Iragan became aware of the simple fact that he was going to have to duel with everyone watching. The bulk of the training grounds were occupied by a crooked block of foot soldiers, struggling with shields and poleaxes nearly as tall as themselves. They drilled as a group in formations. Practicing beside them were hundreds of individual warriors outfitted with swords, maces, spears, staves, flails, shields of all shapes and sizes, and even, Iragan saw, someone with a pitchfork. He supposed that, when all else failed, one might as well be able to put any tool left lying around to use. There were as many dwarves as humans on the field at the time that Iragan and Murtagh arrived there. The two groups mainly kept to themselves, as if an invisible line separated them from intermingling. Behind the sparring warriors, a broad line of archers fired steadily at grey sackcloth dummies. To Iragan's eyes, there was an impressive number of warriors practicing for battle, but to Murtagh's empire-trained eyes the number was pathetically small. Before either Iragan or Murtagh had a chance to wonder what he was supposed to do, a man, his head and blocky shoulders covered by a mail coif, strode over to them. The rest of him was protected by a rough oxhide suit that still had patches of hair on it. A huge sword, almost as long as Iragan, hung across his broad back. Ran a quick eye over Saphira, Murtagh, and Iragan, as if evaluating how dangerous they were, then said gruffly, "Nerla, Auric, you've been gone too long. There's no one left to spar with." Auric smiled. "Oh, that's because you bruise everyone from head to toe with your monster sword." "Everyone except you," he corrected with a smirk. Auric grunted and said, "That's because I'm faster than a giant like you." The man looked at Iragan and Murtagh again. "I'm Frederick. I've been told that you too would want to spar. I was also told to see how capable you are." Murtagh shrugged and answered first in a long, almost arrogant drawl, "We are more capable than most." Iragan remained silent and waited for Frederick's response. The man in front of them seemed straightforward enough, but he would also be curious to see the new rider in action, along with every single man and dwarf currently sparring on the field. At that moment, Eragon was glad at his half-brother's ability to summon up a wall of cold pride and arrogance that seemed to scorn anyone's attempt at doubt. Sapphira chuckled in his mind, intimidated little one. Yes, it was true, he felt out of place here. He was unused to his fights being observed by anyone other than his companions. Here Eragon felt self-conscious, young and untried. When he was alone, no one but himself and those he knew, it was easy to spar and push his limits without fear of being ridiculed. Frederick shook his. The coif clinked like sack of coins. I doubt any fights you two have been in have lasted more than a few minutes. What we're concerned about is how you'll be able to hold up in a battle that may drag on for hours, or even weeks if it's a siege. Eragon was about to answer when a familiar, much-missed, much-loved voice rang across the field. It was a voice that could both comfort and reprimand, and he had missed it, and above all, he had missed its owner. He had never thought to hear it again. He had thought it would remain in his memories, and always, for as long as he lived, belong to a friend that he was too slow to save. Both he and Murtagh spun at the same moment, and there she was, Zoe. Zoe with her dark hair braided up and dressed in familiar black clothing. It was Zoe with her usual weapons, and unlike the last time she had been conscious, her face was not grey with exhaustion and pain. The bewitching, quick features were now lit with a radiant smile that made her blue-grey eyes shine. She looked remarkably unchanged, as if she hadn't just spent the last week and a bit in a coma. Everything about her outward physical appearance was the same, but the long Eragon regarded her, the more he thought he saw something different. It was something intangible, a faint aura of power that hung about Zoe like an invisible cloak, and while he had seen it maybe once or twice before on their journey from Dras Leona, now it seemed to have settled around her and stayed there. Whatever it was or how it had come to be there, Eragon did not know. Her voice, clear and faintly amused, rang out again. Murtagh, Eragon, Sapphira. He was not aware of walking forward, but he found himself standing in front of Zoe. Murtagh and Sapphira were right there too, and in silence of this moment, the rider forgot about the dueling soldiers to Frederick, who was watching curiously. Without thinking about the hundreds of people who were sure to see this, or about any of the things that would be said, Eragon embraced Zoe tightly. I'm glad to see you again, Zoe, whispered the rider into her hair. He hoped she realized just how much he had, and not just him, but Sapphira as well. Her reply was soft. And I you, Eragon. She squeezed him tightly once more, and then they drew back looking at each other. Changed or not, thought Eragon amused, this was still the Zoe he knew. Zoe moved past him and went to Sapphira, who she embraced tightly around the neck. They spoke privately. Whatever was said between them was enough to make the giant blue dragon hum with happiness, and if it was possible, Zoe's smile grew even more, and then the girl turned to Murtagh. The two obviously very pleased to see each other. But Eragon was distracted from watching their meeting by the simple fact that Arya was also there. He had not noticed her, for his attention had been so focused on Zoe and the feelings that seeing her had brought to the forefront of his mind. Remembering his manners, Eragon greeted the elf with the traditional elvish phrase, and Arya replied in a similar fashion. On the outside, the elf appeared coldly regal, but Eragon was certain that he saw a little bit of amusement in her cool green eyes. The time he had known her, Eragon had never managed to broach this cold exterior, and instead he tried to be nothing but polite and reserved in his exchanges with the elf. It was then that Zoe turned and said, "Who wants to spar?" Her smile had a wicked edge to it, and her eyes danced with anticipation. Inwardly, Eragon groaned and hoped he would not be the one who was pummeled by Zoe. He had hoped she had not come to spar, but obviously it would take more than fatal poison to hold her down for long. Though he hoped she would know her limits well enough to stop before she overdid it. Perhaps, however, his friend was well aware of what was coming and the importance of being up to the challenge of battle. They would all need to be honed and ready for the conflict. Frederick, with a silent Auric beside him, was watching the proceedings with an amused but slightly worried smile. At Zoe's words he said kindly, and with a faint hint of condescension, "My lady, I mean no disrespect, but surely you cannot spar so soon after recovering." Zoe gave him a slight smile, but Eragon saw the steely glint in her eyes and winced. He had made Frederick's mistake before and had learned, as Zoe had intended him to, that it was never wise to speak such things to the young woman. Brahm may be the king of lectures and reprimands, but Zoe was a passionate arguer, and Aragon had never mentioned it again. In a cool voice, she replied with a very cold smile. I can assure you that I am recovered enough from the poison to spar. I would not suggest it if I did not feel I was ready. Frederick opened his mouth to speak, but Auric beat him to it. The dwarf's eyes were watching the young woman with keen interest, and it was obvious to all that Auric was curious to see her in action. From the warning way, he put a hand on Frederick's arm. The dwarf was also aware that continuing the argument would only end up with Frederick on the ground with a sword at his neck. In his gravelly voice, the dwarf said, Let her be Frederick. She wouldn't be here if the healers, though she could not handle it. Frederick looked reluctant and was about to say something more, but Zoe had already dismissed him and turned to look at Arya, Iragan, Murtagh, and Saphira. With one eyebrow arched, she asked with a smile, Well, who wants to spar? Murtagh stepped forward, a faint smirk playing on his face, and said, I'll go with you if Iragan goes with Arya. Iragan felt apprehension grow inside of him. He could barely fight Zoe, let alone Arya. Even the weakest elf could easily overpower a human, and Arya was far from weak. As if reading his thoughts, Arya cast him a small, amused smirk, and before Iragan could say anything, Arya answered for him. That is a fine idea. With that, the elf, along with Murtagh and Zoe, walked into the center of the training grounds. Iragan followed close behind with Saphira. The warriors ceased their sparring, parting before them, and within a few seconds, the entire field fell silent as all turned to watch the events unfolding. As the last of the sound of clatter from weapons died away, those present turned to watch the duels about to take place with eager anticipation. When they reached the open space that had been cleared, Zoe and Murtagh squared off while Arya stood beside Iragan and Saphira. The two combatants drew their swords and began to circle the other until, suddenly, with a crash of steel upon steel, the two engaged. They dueled up and down, recklessly combining and disassembling moves in ways that both demonstrated their skill and their fearless fighting styles. At points, it was difficult to tell what blade belonged to who as the two danced back and forth. They were a well-matched pair. Murtagh was stronger than Zoe, but each warrior's technical skill equal. Where Murtagh relied on heavy blows or physical bulk, Zoe relied on speed or grace to carry her through. As the duel wore on, the young woman began to dominate the fight more and more. Murtagh, finding himself more on the defensive, turned his attacks to parries and blocks with the occasional foray against Zoe. After a particular intense series of blows that saw sparks fly from the two swords, Zoe, with a flick of her wrist and a swift spin, sent Murtagh's sword flying out of his hand. Stunned silence from the gathered soldiers met the completion of the duel, and Iragan was rather amused to see the surprised expression upon Frederick's heavy face. Auric, meanwhile, remained as unreadable as a stone wall, his face set as he regarded the scene before him. Raising the point of her shining sword to Murac's throat, she asked with a smile, Thank you, Murtagh. I needed that. Murtagh just groaned in response and pushed his sweaty hair back from his brow. Lowering her blade, Zoe glanced around at the silent, odd crows of soldiers who were staring at her as if she was completely different species. Iragan could have sworn she looked a little embarrassed by the attention. Once Murtagh had gathered his sword, the two switched positions with Arya and Iragan taking their turn on the combat field. An even deeper silence fell as the soldiers watched the two fighters. A kind of eager anticipation rising, for of course, this was sure to be a fight to remember. The dragon rider, not just any rider but their rider, paired against an elven ambassador who was famously ruthless with a sword and had been known to disarm a man in less than 30 seconds. Was it any wonder that the silence was so complete? To see Murtagh and Zoe fight was one thing and this was another. As Iragan drew Zarok, he heard Frederick mutter to Auric, I wonder who will win. Iragan smiled grimly. Not me, he thought. In his mind, Saphira said, Acquit yourself well, Iragan. She does not wish to harm you, but instead find out your level of skill. Right. With that, Iragan focused solely on his blade, knowing that he was going to have to use every single movement, trick, slash, parry, jab, and block. He had to even keep pace with Arya. Yet, despite his fear, he was also strangely excited. This was a chance to test himself against an elf and find out just how good he really was. After all the training he had done these past months, he could finally determine whether he was a capable warrior, and Aragon was determined he would at least prove he was capable enough to remain and fight in the upcoming battle. They faced each other across the circle of warriors. Arya drew her sword with her left hand. The weapon was thinner than Aragon's, but just as long and sharp. Copying the movement, Aragon slid Zarok out of its polished sheath and held the red blade point down at his side. For a long moment they stood motionless, elf and human watching each other. It flashed through Aragon's mind that this was how many of his fights with Brahm and Zoe began. Watching, waiting, calculating. Aragon initiated the fight by moving forward and raising his sword ever so slightly. With a blur of motion, Arya jumped at him, slashing at his ribs. Aragon reflexively parried the attack, and their swords met in a shower of sparks. Zarok was battered aside as if it were no more than a fly. Fighting Arya was a little like fighting Zoe, but not even his friend could match the enhanced speed and strength of the elf. Knowing that the only way to hold his own was to keep moving and keep from being backed into a corner, Aragon began the most complicated series of attack he knew. He flowed from one pose to another, recklessly combining and modifying in every possible way. But no matter how inventive he was, Arya's sword always stopped his. She matched his actions with effortless grace, as though it was the easiest thing in the world, and it was for her. Aragon could never remember how long they fought for. It was timeless, filled with nothing but the motions, the clatter of swords and feeling of Zarok in his sweaty hand. As time went on, however, Aragon began to feel the effects of the fierce fighting. He was strong, fit after weeks of dueling, but his endurance could not match that of Arya's, whose veins hummed with magic. At last, in an ill-considered move, he lunged forward only to have Arya sidestep and sweep her own blade up to his jawbone with supernatural speed. Aragon froze as the icy metal touched his skin. His muscles trembled from the extortion. Dimly he heard Saphira bugle and the warriors cheering raucously around them. Arya lowered her sword and sheathed it. She nodded her head slightly. "You have passed my test," she said quietly. Dazed, he slowly straightened and sheathed his blade before turning to look back at Saphira, who was grinning widely. "Well done, little one. I lost," he snapped, feeling irritated and little put out. Despite his skill, he was no match for Arya and by extension Durza. Maybe, but few could have held Arya off as you did, and for as long as you did. You are still learning, little one, and what matters more is giving it your best try, no matter the outcome. Oryx smiled a rare smile and clapped Aragon on the arm and said, "Well fought." Murtagh nodded in agreement and rested a hand briefly on his half-brother's shoulder, while Zoe just smiled happily at him. She appeared pleased with him and his performance that day, and despite the final outcome of the duel, Aragon was glad that he at least managed to acquit himself well enough that no one would dare challenge his right to fight based on skill alone. It was a start, and he had to start from somewhere. Everyone was about to disperse when Arya called out, "Zoe, your turn." The soldiers stared in amazement, and even the dwarves murmured in surprise. I glanced at Arya, and despite the faint fluttering of nerves I felt at the idea of taking on the elf, I drew my sword and walked back into the center of the open space created by the soldiers. It was a challenge that I was unable to resist despite the weakness that still lingered in my body from the poison. Trying to tell myself this would be fun, and without pausing to think too hard on what I was about to do, I drew my blade for the second time that day. I considered what I knew about the elf and her vastly superior skill. Arya was faster, stronger, and from what I knew of myself right then, probably more experienced than I was. She, like me, was going in for the win, and neither of us was going to give in easily to the other. I also knew that I was probably only going to win this fight by pure, sheer luck, and the most likely outcome would be in Era's favor, but that did not stop me. Better to try than never know. With that, we squared off, each holding our swords loosely as we paced out a circle. We watched each other with unblinking concentration, waiting for the other to make a move. As I paced watching Arya, a sudden sense of calm spread through me. It was just a duel. This was nothing new or different for me, and it only would be if I let myself get intimidated by my partner. I knew how to fight. I knew what my weaknesses and strengths were, so the only thing to do was let the fight play out as it did. I was ready. I had been ready for a duel like this for a long time. Right. Keep telling yourself that, Zoe. Keep telling yourself you've been ready for a long time, and then, when you end up flat on your back, just remember that you went into like a confident fool. It was Arya who acted first. Leaping, moved forward, her blade coming down to strike at my sword arm, but I dodged the attack, and this unbalanced Arya enough that I was able to initiate the first strike at her undefended right side with my sword. She parried, and with a nod to each other as these opening forays were completed, we began to duel in earnest. This was the first fight I had fought since arriving in Alagaesia where I was evenly matched, if not bettered, by another swordsman. It took all of my focus, all of my speed to keep up and stay on the attack instead of the defensive. Yet, despite my best attempts, Arya's blade always stopped mine. It was similar to what had happened to Aragon, and because I am a competitive person, it made me irritated. In a brief respite when both of us separated and returned to our pacing, I quickly reviewed all my options and all my potential attacks. Nothing came to me. I had exhausted all my tricks, and I was beginning to wonder if I should just admit defeat now. My pride quickly rejected that idea, and I returned to watching my partner as I waited for the fight to start again. My breaths were coming fast, and my hair was plastered to the back of neck with sweat. I was not as fit and strong as I had been before Gilead, and I felt it keenly then. With an almost invisible movement, Arya lunged forward, and I sidestepped before re-engaging her. I don't know how I did it. I probably will never do it again. In fact, I know I will never do it again, and it was only dumb luck that saw me through, and in the end that was the most humbling thing of all in this duel between the elf and I, you see. As I spun to avoid a jab, I caught the flat of Arya's blade with my own blade. The force of the blow made her hand slip too far back to give her a good grip, which then translated into lose my sword, because I hit her blade with the flat of my own. The move sent Arya's sword flying to the ground and silence fell. Over. I was breathing hard as I raised my sword to Arya's throat, and I felt a little better when I saw that she too looked a little winded by our duel, not sweaty and panting like me, of course, but slightly winded. Meanwhile, little me was trying to comprehend what had just happened. I had won. By pure luck, of course, but still I had won. I had won a fair and honest duel with an elf on nothing but luck. How had I just done that? Arya looked like she was wondering the same thing. I lowered my sword and resheathed it. My arm ached from the intensity of the fight, and I in general felt like a wet, overcooked noodle. My stomach ached, and I wondered if I had maybe overdone it. I had just come back from death's doorstep after all, and engaging in heated duels was probably not the wisest of choices. Meeting my gaze, Arya shook her head. I've never been beaten by a human. I smiled tiredly. Doubt I can manage that again, Arya Svitkona. Arya just shrugged in response, and we sheathed our swords, or in the case of Arya, picked up weapons and then sheathed them. Frederick, in his loud, rough, booming voice, was the first to break the very uncomfortable silence that had fallen across the field. Today has been the day of duels. Remember what you saw today, lads. It is what we aim for. With that he clapped me on the shoulder. The force of the blow nearly sent me face planting into the ground, but I managed to regain my balance, and my breath, enough to speak. Thank you. I quickly moved out of back-slapping zone, and closer to Saphira, who was both larger and not prone to back-slapping. Arya cast me an amused glance, and without a word, began to walk through the lines of men and back towards the white marble city. The men parted for her as if she carried the plague, and I walked over to Aragon, Murtagh, and Saphira, who were watching me silently. Would you like to return? I asked. Yes, said Aragon, who looked about as worn out as I felt. Auric also joined us, though I suspected he would have much rather remained at the training fields with Frederick than accompany his charges back to the city. As we walked city, nothing was said. It was not an uncomfortable silence, but rather a reflective one. Saphira and Aragon were obviously talking, but privately, and Murtagh was lost in his own thoughts. Arya, who was walking a few meters ahead of us, did not wait for us to catch up. When we reached the gates, Auric said to Aragon, "My king wished to see you and Saphira later this afternoon. Would you agree to meet me at the central chamber in an hour?" "Of course," said Aragon. Behind him, Saphira nodded her great blue head. Auric nodded, and then bade us good afternoon before he vanished into the crowd who were beginning to gather to admire Saphira. Arya glanced at the sky before saying, "Till later." She vanished into the crowd that was beginning to form, cutting her way through the gathered group of dwarves, and Varden with ease for all backed away from her. Iragan glanced after her before turning to Murtagh, and I will see you two later, he asked with a nervous glance at the crowd. I nodded. Yes. Saphira lowered her head and met my gaze. Would you meet us after our meeting with Hrothgar? I would like to speak with you. Of course, Saphira. With that, Iragan clambered up on Saphira, who promptly took flight. There were murmured words of awe among the humans in the crowd who began to disperse once the main attraction, Iragan and Saphira, were gone. I wondered briefly whether child Elva was right now. She had yet to blessed cursed by Iragan and Saphira, and I wondered if she would. Was this another thing that by simply being here I had changed? Elva was so important, and yet she was to live a cursed life that was far from happy. What would effects of not having her be? I sighed inwardly and hoped that a power greater than I would decide Elva's fate. Murtagh interrupted my thoughts and said, "Would you walk with me? I would like to talk with you." Everybody seemed to want me to talk with them. My dance card was rapidly filling up. I nodded and said, "Sure, where to?" Inwardly, I longed for a good bath. I was sweaty from the fight, and since waking up in the healing ward, I had not had a chance to wash my hair after the long miles on the road. I knew that I smelled pretty disgusting, and my muscles ached. No, I longed for a good soak in hot water, if only to ease away the aches and lingering weakness. Murtagh looked a little relieved. Back to the upper levels. Maybe we can find the library or some food. With that, we began to walk away from the massive front gates and up towards the top of the citadel. People made way for us. Some openly stared, and others seemed wary, as if they were unsure what to think of us or how to react. No doubt word of our sparring had reached the city, and it had only made us all the more interesting as well as strange to the Varden and dwarves. I'm not sure how we ended up there, and I doubt I could find it again, but our wanderings brought us to a quiet, secluded garden in a small, circular courtyard. It was in the upper levels of Trondheim, probably not far from the quarters that Arya had. The place had an untended, timeless feel to it. A small, tinkling fountain was in the center, and flowers. Small trees and other plants had been allowed to grow wherever they wanted to, and in no particular order. A small bench underneath a flowering apple tree looked appealing, and so we both silently took a seat. Neither of us wished to break the magical stillness of the garden, and so we sat for a few silent, reflective minutes. Another garden, a little like this one, flashed across my eyes, only adding to my peaceful mood, and so when Murtagh spoke, I did not immediately respond. "Zoe," he said, "I have something I want to ask you." "What?" I asked, resting my chin on my hands. You've changed. Since you woke up, you aren't the same." "Why?" I was so surprised that I turned to look at Murtagh, who, for the first time I had known him, looked completely relaxed and completely at peace with both himself and his surroundings. The resemblance to his half-brother was quite striking then. When I found my voice, I said, "What do you mean, Murtagh?" He was silent for a moment before saying, "You are different, not in a bad way, but different. You seem stronger, more settled in yourself than you were before. You surprised everyone today, from Ajahad to Brahm to the Varden as a whole." I sighed and said softly, "Oh, Murtagh, it's so complicated, and I had hoped that it was not even affecting me. You see, Murtagh," I bit my lip and paused before saying even softer, "I found out why I am here, why I was sent to Alagaesia, and it also changed. Well, it changed everything I thought I knew about myself. About, well, who I really was and what I've done." Murtagh said nothing, just quietly urged me on with his dark, hooded eyes. For the second time that day I explained just what Eamund had told me. Like Arya, he was silent until the end, and like Arya, he did not demand anything of me or call me a liar. He just sat and looked at the tinkling fountain. I did nothing. I had nothing more to say, and I was also thinking over what this meant both for me and for those around me. I would foolish to think that this would not change my relationship with Murtagh, a relationship that was getting increasingly more complicated. At last he sighed and just shrugged. "I don't know what to say, Zoe. It's all right, Murtagh." I turned back to admiring the fountain and the garden. My peaceful mood was now tinged with sadness, though I did not quite know why. What reaction had I thought these words would get? I turned slightly so that I was looking at Murtagh, and our eyes met. Then Murtagh did something that was so shocking and so unexpected that I did not know what to do, and I am not sure what anyone would do if it happened to them in such a situation. His hands, calloused and scarred, gently gripped my face, and he bent his head so that we were eye to eye. "Promise me something, Zoe," he murmured. I kept looking into those walled and hooded eyes and waited for him to continue. "Promise me that you will not let yourself become lost in what you think you must be now." As I looked up into his face, I suddenly realized two things. One was that I would promise this to Murtagh because he was right. The second was that the last boy I had kissed was currently back on Earth, and that had been the one and only kiss I could remember right now. Somehow, among thoughts of kissing and promises, I found my voice enough to say something reasonable. "I promise, Murtagh." My voice was surprisingly level considering how I felt at that particular moment in time. To my utmost relief, Murtagh dropped his hands and nodded. "Good." Silence fell between us, awkward silence that went unbroken for many minutes until Murtagh said, "We should go. There is much to do and little time." Yet he sounded as reluctant as I was to leave this little sanctuary in the middle of a city made of marble. I wondered how Arya managed to live here for any length of time. As an elf, she would much rather be surrounded by nature than stone. I was beginning to feel the same way. For all its beauty, Trondheim was too cold. I nodded, but made no move to rise from the little bench under the flowering apple tree. It was then that I noticed a particularly beautiful flower growing not far from the fountain. Reaching out, I cupped the bloom in my hands and examined it. The flower was a deep gold color shot through with bright blue. As I looked and admired it, a memory flashed across my eyes. I was sitting in a garden very much like this one, and holding a flower that was the exact copy of the one I was holding in Alagaesia. However, I was no longer with Murtagh, but instead a dark-haired boy was sitting beside me. He was laughing, and somehow I knew he was laughing at something I had said. My heart gave a painful lurch, and as quickly as it had come, the memory was gone. Murtagh had not even noticed, and I quickly dropped the flower before rising. I could not stay there, not with that memory haunting my current thoughts. I wanted to run, to do something to take my mind off what I had seen and felt. Murtagh rose as well, and we stood looking at each other. "Where will you go?" he asked. I shrugged. "I'm hungry, so I might go searching for the kitchens, and then go back to wait for Aragon and Saphira. What about you?" I did not tell him I would do anything to get away from this place. "I think I'll go to the library. I can seclude myself in there, and no one will notice me." With that we parted, Murtagh going one way and I the other. As I walked, I wondered over the feelings I had gotten from Murtagh that day, and the memory that had made me feel like someone had just sent a spike through my heart. I could not afford a relationship with Murtagh that was more than friendship. In the end, if that end came as it should, his heart would belong to Naswada, not me. Never me. I was someone who in the end would have to leave. I shook my head and kept walking. Of all the lines to come to my head, it was one from the Mortal Instrument series. That collection of books I had been reading right before I had fallen into the pages of Aragon in my old mother's rose garden. It was, "To love is to destroy," and in this case it rang true. To feel anything more than sisterly affection for Murtagh was to destroy everything. Why? I thought irritably, why me? Why this of all things? Of course no one answered. Revised on 1/16/2014. Hope you enjoyed. 24. Chapter 25. Aragon and Saphira met Auric in the central chamber before following him down a new corridor. With his sword buckled at his hip and one hand on Saphira's side, they followed the dwarf into Trondheim. Ignoring stares from people within the soaring corridor, Aragon asked, "Where will we meet Hrothgar?" Without slowing his pace, Auric said over his shoulder, "In the throne room beneath the city. It will be a privy audience as an act of Arthur, of faith. You do not have address him in any special way, but speak to him respectfully. Hrothgar is quick to anger, but he is wise and sees keenly into the minds of men, so think carefully before you speak." Aragon nodded and retreated to his thoughts, wondering what awaited him in this particular audience. The steps that they were walking down curved inward like a spiral until it faced the direction they had come from. The other stairway merged, also curved downward, to form a broad cascade of dimly lit steps that ended, after 100 feet, before two granite doors. A 7-pointed crown was carved across both doors. The silver inlay sparkled dimly in the warm glow cast by the dwarvish lanterns. 7 dwarves stood guard on each side of the portal. They held burnished mattocks and wore gem-encrusted belts. As Iragan, Auric, and Saphira approached, the dwarves pounded the floor with the mattock's hafts. A deep boom rolled back up the stairs. The doors swung inward, and Iragan took a deep breath as he squared his shoulders and schooled his face into an impassive mask. A dark hall lay before them, a good bowshot long. The throne room was a natural cave. The walls were lined with stalagmites and stalactites, each thicker than a man. Sparsely hung lerns cast a moody light. The brown floor was smooth and polished. At the far end of the hall was a black throne with a motionless figure upon it. Auric bowed. "The king awaits you." Iragan put his hand on Saphira's side, and the two of them continued forward. The doors closed behind them, leaving them alone in the dim throne room with the king. Their footsteps echoed through the hall as they advanced toward the throne. In the recesses between the stalagmites and stalactites rested larger statues. Each sculpture depicted a dwarf king crowed and sitting on a throne. Their sightless eyes gazed sternly into the distance, their lined faces set in fierce expressions. A name was chiseled in runes beneath each set of feet. Iragan and Saphira strode solemnly between the 2 rows of long-dead monarchs. They passed more than 40 statues, then only dark and empty alcoves awaiting future kings. They stopped before the dwarf kind at the end of the hall. Hrothgar himself was as still as any of the statues in the alcoves. The throne he sat upon was on a raised dais and carved from a single piece of black marble. It was simple, unadorned, and cut with unyielding precision, as if reminding those who gazed upon it of the duties of kings to their people. Strength emanated from it, like a reminder that the dwarves had ruled this land for far longer than humans or elves. A gold helm lined with rubies and diamonds rested on Hrothgar's head in place of a crown. His visage was grim, weathered, and the experience of decades shone through his deep-set, flinty eyes. His white beard was tucked under his belt, and in his lap he held a mighty war hammer with the symbol of Auric's clan embossed on its head. Iragan bowed his head slightly, and Saphira remained upright, her glittering eyes never leaving the king. Stirring, as if awakening from a spell, the king rumbled, as knurled Dami Lanark. "Beware the rock changes," an old saying of ours, and nowadays the rock changes very fast indeed. He fingered the war hammer. "I could not meet with you earlier as Ajahad did, because I was forced to deal with my enemies within the clans. They demanded that I deny you sanctuary and expel you. It has taken much work on my part to convince them otherwise." "Thank you," said Iragan. "I didn't anticipate how much strife my arrival would cause." The king accepted his thanks, then lifted a gnarled hand and pointed. "See there, Rider Iragan, where my predecessors sit upon their thrones. 140 there are with I the 42nd. When I pass from this world and into the care of the guards, I will join their ranks. For 8 millennia, since the dawn of our race, dwarves have ruled under Farthen-Dur. We are the bones of the land, older than both the fair elves and the savage dragons." Saphira shifted slightly, and Iragan sent her soothing thoughts as Hrothgar continued. "I am old human, even by our reckoning, old enough to remember the riders. Now you sit before me. A relic from a forgotten age, and much is expected from you. You have fled the Empire and come here. Now what will you do? War is coming to Farthen-Dur. Will you stay or go? Who will you be?" Iragan was silent for a long moment, gazing steadily into the ancient eyes of the king. His answer could not be rushed. It could not have a single flaw that the dwarf could exploit. In a steady, even voice, Iragan said, "Saphira and I will stay for the battle. It is our duty as rider and dragon. After that I will journey to the elves for training. I have the strength to help those who need me, and I shall to the best of my abilities. Saphira and I came to Farthen-Dur to find sanctuary from our troubles, but we shall not remain here, hiding from our destiny, whatever it is." The kind seemed satisfied by his answer. He turned to Saphira and asked, "Dragon, what think you in this matter? For what reason have you come?" Saphira lifted the edge of her lip to growl. The sound echoed around the chamber, and her tail flicked from side to side. "Tell him that I thirst for the blood of our enemies, and eagerly await the say when we ride to battle against Galbatorix. And tell him that I think you ready for the task." Withholding a grimace at the harsh words, he dutifully relayed them word for word. They seemed to amuse the king, who shook his head ever so slightly. Dragons have not changed in all the years I have known them. One last matter remains. I wish to know what you will do if Galbatorix falls and the Varden are victorious. Once again, Iragan wondered at the king's motives. He had yet to think ahead to what would be awaiting him in Du Weldenvarden, let alone what was waiting for him if he managed to climb the unclimbable mountain and defeat Galbatorix. Knowing that, once again, Hrothgar had demanded an answer that was as solid as the black throne he sat on, and as firm as the hammer in his lap, Iragan answered. I want no crown, nor would it be wise for a rider to assume such a position. I will not take the throne. With a nod of his head, the king reached out a hand and said, You carry a cursed sword, rider. Ajihad told me of this. It does not please me to see this weapon despite the skill with which it was crafted. May I examine it? Iragan drew his sword and presented it to the king, who grasped it and ran a practiced eye over the red blade. The edge caught the lantern light, and shadows flickered across the blade. With a nod, he returned Zarok and said, Despite my feelings for that sword, it is still a masterful piece of workmanship. Perhaps you will forge it a new history, but I would rather you did not carry it. Iragan resheathed the sword, and the king nodded once before continuing. My advisors wait for me, as there are matters dealing with the upcoming battle I must deal with. I will say this, though. If you wish the support of the dwarves, then you must prove yourself. I will remember your advice, said Iragan, inclining his head to the king. Hrothgar nodded regally. You may go. Iragan turned with Saphira, and they proceeded out of the hall and back into the entrance room. Oric was waiting for them on the other side of the stone doors, looking about as nervous as Iragan had ever seen him. It amused the rider a little to see the normally unflappable dwarf so concerned for him. Did all go well? Asked Oric tensely. With a reassuring smile, Iragan said, I think so. Your king is cautious. That is how he has survived this long. They began to follow Oric back up the steps and away from the king in his stone hall. He did not approve of me. No, said Iragan, but he is a dwarf after all. However, he did not make any outright slight against you. That seemed to amuse Saphira. In that he is wise. He's not even knee-high to me. Saphira, that is not funny. Yes, it is. That is not very diplomatic of you. Dragons are not diplomats. We leave that to humans and elves. Iragan sighed in irritation and ignored Saphira's laughter as it flowed across their mental link. He could not help but share in her amusement despite his irritation. They emerged into the brightly lit central chamber where, to Iragan's joy, Zoe was waiting for them. She was leaning against one of the pillars along the side of the wall, and people skirted her nervously with the occasional "my lady" or polite nod. Zoe, on the other hand, looked bored and coolly amused by the reactions of those around her. When she saw them, she smiled and unhitched herself from the tall marble pillar. She made her way over, cutting a path through the people. Oric, she greeted the dwarf before nodding to Saphira and Iragan. The dwarf inclined his head and left the three for whatever other duties awaited him. Zoe gestured upwards towards the dragon hold. We should go soon, or you'll be covered in admirers before you can say, Rider. There was a teasing note to her voice, but Iragan groaned in response. He had yet to really deal with the Varden, mostly because the women and children would be leaving the next day in preparation for the upcoming battle, and all attention was on that. Mounting Saphira, Iragan offered Zoe a hand up, and the dragon took flight, soaring upwards through the city mountain. She landed on the giant gem, and the two dismounted before following her inside the cave. Saphira curled up on her cushion, and Iragan and Zoe sat down beside her, leaning their backs against her warm side. For a long time there was silence until Zoe said, How was it with Hrothgar? Iragan shrugged. It went well enough. Does not approve of both Saphira and I, but he will not go against us, I think. No, he can't to do that. You and Saphira are too important in the fight against Galbatorix. Hrothgar also knows that eventually the dwarves will have to face him, and he would rather have you on his side. Maybe not close, but close enough that he can call on your aid. He is too wise and crafty to discard a tool that could save his people one day. Iragan digested her words before saying, Will you come with us to the elves? Watched his friend closely. She was not looking at him, but at the far wall of the cavern. Her eyes were distant and clouded with thought. Zoe played with a strand of her hair before saying, Maybe. I would like to, but I might need to stay here. It will depend a little on Murtagh as well. I don't fancy leaving him with the Varden for an extended period of time. Brahm can only do so much as well, and he may need my help." Iragan nodded. He had also wondered about the fate of his older half-brother. So far no one had commented on Murtagh's parentage, and Iragan was sure that was because of Brahm and Arya. Eventually, however, the truth would come out, and when it did, well, Iragan was unsure what the consequences might be. "Zoe," said Saphira, "what will you do after the war?" Hrothgar asked Iragan that question today, and it has made me reflect on the future and what will happen to us. Zoe smiled slightly. "I'm not sure, Saphira. I have a family to return to eventually, but I have come to love Alagaesia. It will not be easy to leave here, but I also want to return home. We'll see. There is much that could happen that may influence what I want from my future." Iragan was about to speak when he heard the sounds of soft paws walking across the stone floor. Glancing up, the young rider saw the tawny, cat form of Salimbum lazily pacing towards the three friends. The werecat stopped in front of Iragan and Zoe. In his lazy, rumbling voice he said, "Angela wants to see you, Ryder." "Angela, she's here," asked Iragan, confused. He glanced at Zoe, but she did not look surprised or even questioning. She was just smiling at the cat, and Salimbum allowed the girl to stroke him behind his ears for a few moments before turning to look at Iragan again. His mental voice took on a new tone of impatience. "Yes, hurry up. You wouldn't want to be accused of being slow off the mark, would you?" With that, Salimbum began to walk away and back towards the end of the chamber. He conveyed bored impatience with the entire situation, his tail flicking from side to side with saucy relaxation. "Go, Iragan," said Zoe with a push. "An invitation to visit Angela is nothing to turn your nose up at." Standing up, feeling confused, Iragan asked, "But how is she even here? How do you know?" "Go, or Salimbum won't wait any longer," said the girl with a mischievous grin, and shaking his head in confusion, Iragan hurried after the werecat, who had paused at the entrance waiting for the rider, before continuing on his tail, waving gracefully from side to side. Murtagh sighed, and turned another page in the dusty book he had chosen randomly from a shelf. His thoughts whirred as he tried to focus on the neat cursive in front of him. The book was called The Preferred Guide to Battle, but Murtagh had yet to really pay any attention to the words, and so far he could not remember any of the words in front of him. He had hoped that reading would help settle him and clear his thoughts, but it had done nothing of the kind. In fact, it had only made him more frustrated with the world in general. Leaning back in the comfortable armchair in the secluded, deathly quiet corner of the library he had chosen for himself, Murtagh let out an irritated sigh. What was wrong with him? There was a stupid, bloody battle looming on the horizon. He was surrounded by potential enemies, but despite all that, his entire mind was filled with Zoe. Zoe and more Zoe. Zoe smiling at him. Zoe laughing at him. Zoe challenging his opinions on everything from the weather to Galbatorix. The terror he had felt in his heart when he had seen her lying seeming unconscious in a prison cell. Zoe beating him with a sword. In general, his mind was full of Zoe. He had had one experience similar to this in his life. About 3 years ago, he had fallen madly in love with the beautiful and witty daughter of a noble. Murtagh shook his head slightly in embarrassment. He could recall exactly what Tornak had told him when he had shown up with stars in his eyes and her name on his lips, along with all her wonderful traits. The old swordsman had sat the young man down and told him very firmly that he had better get his head on straight, and then he would see that this love was as fleeting as a butterfly. Love, the old man had said, must be like a slow burning ember that can outlast the test of time. A passion that burns bright will die as quickly as it came. As usual, he had been right, and within a few days, Murtagh no longer felt like throwing himself out of the nearest tower window just because she might ask it of him. Murtagh let out another noisy sigh as he glared at the open book in front of him. His feelings were not as clear-cut as they had been when he had fancied that particular woman. No, whatever Zoe had done to him, it was not something that Murtagh could easily explain or understand. Closing his eyes, the young man tried to sort out exactly what he was feeling. There was nervous, giddy happiness mixed in with trepidation. However, the strongest emotion he felt was not what he had expected. He, a son of Morzan who had faced terrors uncounted, was frightened. Fear coiled inside of him, and he tried to ignore it. He was frightened that Zoe would reject him, frightened that his love for her would mean an end to their friendship, and above all, frightened because there was a chance that he would lose her either in the upcoming battle or when she returned to her own home. Eventually, he would lose her, just as he had lost everyone else in his life from his mother to Tornak. No, thought Murtagh firmly, I cannot feel love for her. She can't stay. It will be just another disappointment in my life. Either one of us might die tomorrow. I can't put that burden on already has enough to deal with without adding my feelings to it. A little voice spoke up from somewhere deep inside of him. But it asked, isn't it better to love even for a short time than to die without experiencing that emotion? You have always wanted to feel loved and wanted. If we have a short time to live and be happy, then why not be happy? Why not love? Why not? Why not love her? His thoughts were, rather rudely in Murtagh's opinion, interrupted by a cool voice behind him. Glaring at a book does not change what is written in it. Whipping around, one hand going to his sword, and the other the arm rest of the chair to act as a spring when he drew his sword, Murtagh saw a woman. She was one of the most striking women he had ever met. With caramel-colored skin, big brown eyes that glittered with fierce intelligence, and black hair that was braided up, she could only be Ajahad's daughter, Naswada. She was wearing a dress of rich red that had been embroidered with golden scroll work along the hem, and a belt of interlocking gold loops showed off her slim waist. In truth, she was very beautiful, but Murtagh ignored it and gazed at her eyes steadily. He had learned long ago that beauty could hide many things. Ajahad's daughter was no pawn and no fool if what he had heard was true. I am sorry to have startled you, she said, gesturing at his hand, which was still gripping the hilt of his sword. Her smile was a little apologetic as she half sat on a carved table laden with dusty volumes. All the while those very innocent, deep brown eyes were on Murtagh as if he was an interesting puzzle. I was just passing through the library when I saw you and I wanted to introduce myself. Her voice was conversational, friendly even. Murtagh watched her silently. He doubted very much that she had only been passing through. No, this was not a chance encounter, and with her exact motive still unknown, he said carefully and very diplomatically, I do not believe we have ever met, my lady. Her smile grew brighter. I am Naswada, daughter of Ajahad. I have heard of you and your adventures with Rider Iragan. Longer Murtagh spent with her, the more he felt there was something strange about her friendliness, as if she hoped to win his trust with her openness, when, in fact, it was that openness and easiness that alerted Murtagh to the possibility that she was really hiding her true motives. He had grown up with people who played the same game, and so, feeling trapped by Naswada, Murtagh rose and said smoothly, I am sorry not that I cannot spend more time with you, my lady, but I promise to meet my friend, Zoe. I hope to be able to continue our conversation another time. Watching her, he saw the slight narrow of Naswada's eyes. He smiled inwardly. So he was right. This was not some simple conversation, and he had just irritated the woman in front of him with his refusal to continue her game of twisted words. Before she could say anything, Murtagh turned and quickly placed the book back on its shelf before making his way from the library. He had just beaten a hasty retreat, but he did not mind. No, he had always hated things like that, and better to retreat. Murtagh glared out a window that overlooked the city. He was annoyed not only with Naswada, but because he had yet to really sort out his feelings for Zoe. Not only that, but he had just been ousted from his refuge, and it irked him to be back out in these far to open marble corridors where people stared at him curiously as if he was some sort of circus act. The last place he could think of was a good climb above him, but Murtagh wanted the exercise and the promise of avoiding people who, he was sure, would not hesitate to kill him if they knew the truth about his parentage. When he reached the main chamber, Murtagh took the stairs that stretched endlessly upwards all the way to the star jewel far above. His brother would be there along with Saphira and Zoe. His steps unconsciously quickened as he made his way through the numerous levels of the city on his way to the Dragon Hold. Revised. 117-2014. Enjoy. Book Lover 19. You beat me to the previous chapter. If you go back, you will see the new revised one posted today just after you read it. No worries if you don't want to. This chapter has been lightly changed, but is basically original. Any chance I could PM you? I am just not sure you have an account on FF. Thank you for spending the time going through this story. As I plow through departmental exams, your reviews make me smile. I don't have very much time for writing, but what I do I try to spend either on this story or my other one. Have an awesome one, and thank you again. Luckyponygirl.